The Christmas Matchmaker, written by Laura Hile, narrated by Benjamin Fife. Chapter 1. Charles Bingley looked as fatigued as Darcy felt, but there was no room for pity today. Bingley's sister was right. He must be packed off to London. "Really, Darcy," he protested as he came down the steps to the drive, "a delay of only one day." "Would be most unwise," said Darcy. "One cannot escape business by hiding in the country, Charles. Trust me to know." "But I did not turn in until almost 4, and my bed is calling." Darcy put a firm hand on his friend's shoulder. Bingley must not be allowed to talk his way out of this. There was too much at stake. "I know, my friend, it's cold and you're done in, but you've put this off long enough." A footman held open the doorway to Bingley's travelling coach. "Once you are underway, stretch out on the seat. I've instructed Mrs. Nichols as to what is needed. There, do you see? She has set you up nicely. Pillows and blankets, and, unless I miss my guess, a warm brick for your feet and a flask for comfort." Bingley looked unhappy. "I'm not an old woman." "Think how much better you'll feel to have this behind you." Bingley's red-rimmed eyes met Darcy's. "I intend to return tonight." "Upon my word, man, why? Give yourself a few days." "But there is so much to be done. Here at Netherfield, I mean." "In late November? I think not." "But you said those improvements to the—" "Can wait until spring. Besides, it has been raining all week. What exactly do you intend to accomplish?" But, I must speak with Mr. Bennet as soon as may be. He is Jane's father, you know." Darcy fought to keep from showing alarm. Things with Jane Bennet had become more serious than he realized. "All in good time. Bennet can wait." He closed the coach door behind Charles and signed to the driver. The coach rolled forward, with Bingley's dismayed face showing through the window glass. Darcy forced a smile and lifted a hand. There, the first step of his plan was underway. Or was it Caroline Bingley's plan? This thought brought a grimace. It was his plan, and yet— Darcy dug his hands in his pockets. Only a madman would align himself with Caroline Bingley. But what else could he do? Charles had too soft a heart, and was too easily influenced. Moreover, his fortune made him prey to the likes of Jane Bennet. Her mother's smug complacency last night was galling. Another sigh escaped Darcy's lips. "Haven't I had enough of matchmaking women?" No, his pact with Miss Bingley could not be helped. For who else had Charles's interests at heart? Oh, Caroline said sweet things about Jane, for indeed she was a gentle, kindly girl. But the idea of a marriage alliance with the Bennets was as repugnant to her as it was to Darcy. At the door to the house, Darcy hesitated. His gaze took in the expanse of park, with its winding drive. After last night's ball, it had been lined with carriages. He had stood just here, in the flickering light of the torches, watching Miss Elizabeth Bennet descend to her family's carriage. Elizabeth. Even now he could recall their dance together, and each conversational exchange. Her eyes, sparkling with intelligence and wit, the enigmatic smile, the delicious trill of her laugh. Elizabeth Bennet did not simper or flirt. Indeed, she thoroughly disliked him. And yet before entering the carriage, Elizabeth had looked back at the house, and at him. Their eyes met. Or had they? The distance was great. Perhaps Darcy had imagined that uncanny flash in her eyes. Blast! He was as infatuated with Elizabeth as ever. Charles Bingley was not the only one who must leave the Bennet family behind. Darcy went into the house, crossed the entrance hall, and mounted the stairs. This obsession with Elizabeth Bennet was nothing that a morning ride would not cure. He would change and send word to the stables. Unfortunately, Darcy's trek took him past the open door to the dining room. Brittle laughter drifted out. Why the devil was Caroline Bingley laughing at this hour? He looked in. There she sat, close beside her sister, with a paper between them. "Oh, Mr. Darcy!" Miss Bingley sang out. He had been seen. Politeness demanded a response. Concealing his irritation, Darcy entered the dining room. "You are up early," he remarked. She rewarded him with a conspiratorial smile. How he wished she hadn't. Doubtless she would invite him to sit beside her. He'd see that. Darcy crossed to the sideboard and took up a plate. Since he was here, he might as well eat. "We are putting our plan into action, Louisa," she told her sister. "Charles is now on his way to London, is he not, Mr. Darcy?" Darcy speared several strips of bacon. "He is." Again he was rewarded with a smile. "It is a pity that Charles did not leave earlier. However, all is well that ends well, as the saying goes." "That he managed to leave when he did is a wonder," said Darcy. "It was close on 4 when the last of the guests departed." "Don't I know it?" Caroline Bingley gave a heavy sigh. "The Bennet clan. They simply would not go. I was forced to make conversation with the mother. She is not one to take a hint." "Dear Caroline," soothed Louisa Hurst, "how you have suffered." "The things I do for Charles. A full month wasted in this dreary house. Days and days. Simply because he wished to shoot. And then, although I am feeling quite ghastly this morning, what must he do but leave me to entertain our countrified neighbours? Truly, you have been a saint." Darcy remained silent. Saint was not how he would describe Caroline Bingley. His morning ride was looking better and better, so long as the rain held off. A cup of coffee, a bite of breakfast, and then— "I have written a little note to dear Miss Bennet." Caroline held out a sheet of paper to Darcy. Obviously this was what they had been laughing about. "Do let us hear your opinion." Must she relish the role of co-conspirator so openly? Those looks of hers made Darcy's flesh crawl. Had he cherished a tendeur for Caroline Bingley, which he most certainly had not, this shared contretemps would have cured him of it. Nevertheless, Darcy knew his duty. He abandoned his plate and took the paper Caroline offered. He brought it to the windows to read. Caroline continued to talk. "How I wish that we had left with Charles, and do you know why?" "My dear, it was quite impossible," protested Louisa. "Mr. Hurst will sleep until noon at the very least." Apparently this was not the response Caroline was looking for. "Do you know why, Mr. Darcy?" she repeated. Darcy lifted his gaze from the letter, but he did not look at her. To escape the possibility of rain? She gave a sharp trill of laughter. "What care I for rain? It is the dreary round of morning calls that I must endure. Our so-polite neighbours will come to express gratitude for the ball, and Charles has saddled me with the responsibility of receiving them." Had she forgotten that Charles did not wish to leave? He would have enjoyed conversing with each person who came. Darcy returned to Caroline's letter. It was laced with sweetly worded snubs that even a gentle girl like Jane Bennet could not mistake. This was an ugly business. Darcy tossed the letter onto the dining table. I take it that this note will be delivered after we are gone.
But, of course, I trust I have made my point.
That it is doubtful whether Charles will ever return to Netherfield, yes. Much as Darcy deplored Caroline's crude tactics, Jane Bennet's matrimonial hopes, and those of her mother, must be quashed. He remained at the windows, gazing out at the leaden November sky. Then a movement caught his eye. A coach pulled by 4 horses was coming up the drive. He turned and glanced at Caroline, who was smiling over her letter. A 3-cornered cat's smile it was, and wholly unattractive. "I believe," said Darcy, "that one of your callers has arrived."
"So early? They should not come until 3 at the earliest." Caroline's tone became sharp. "It is Mrs. Bennet and her daughters. I just know it. Wretched woman, come to steal a march on the others, and to plague me to death."
She rose to her feet and reached for the bell-pull.
"I am not at home to callers. Indeed, were it not for the necessity of Charles' departure, I would still be in bed."
Louisa Hurst joined Darcy at the window.
"This is not the Bennet carriage, my dear. It is a travelling coach, nicely appointed, and simply drenched with mud." "Oh, heavens!"
said Caroline Bingley, and she turned away. Darcy hid a smile. He watched as the coach pulled up before the house. 2 ladies, one young, one middle-aged, and a gentleman descended. Mrs. Hurst's tone became animated.
"Caroline, dear, I believe there is a crest painted on the door. Does Sir Lucas, or whatever his name is, have a crest? His title is so new."
From below came the sharp rap of the door-knocker, then voices.
"Saints preserve us," said Caroline. "My poor head already throbs, and my throat is on fire. I do believe that I am becoming ill."
The butler came in with cards. Miss Woodhouse of Hartfield, and Miss Bates, and Mr. Thomas Bertram of Mansfield Park. Louisa Hurst looked to her sister.
"My dear,"
she said softly. Caroline responded with a toss of her head.
"Of course we are not at home to them. The idea!"
The butler went out, but returned almost at once. "The lady, Miss Woodhouse, refuses to go, miss. She insists on seeing Mr. Bingley, and she wishes you to read this." He presented a folded paper. Caroline opened it. Darcy longed to see what it said, for her dismayed expression was comical.
"I know nothing of this invitation," she said at last. "Mr. Bingley is not here. He has gone to London. Tell these people to come back another day."
Meanwhile, Louisa Hurst had come to her sister's side.
"Caroline, dear, we are acquainted with Sir Thomas Bertram. I believe this must be the son. He is not someone to be, as Mr. Hurst so charmingly says, fobbed off. And Miss Woodhouse of Hartfield."
She murmured something in Caroline's ear.
"Oh, very well."
Caroline paired this ungracious statement with a look at Darcy.
"If I must see them, I must. Show them into the front."
But the butler had already gone out. Caroline spread her hands.
"The staff in this house, hopeless, all of them, receiving callers at the breakfast table."
The door came open again. "Miss Woodhouse and Miss Bates," announced the butler. "Mr. Bertram will be joining you presently."
"Presently," muttered Caroline. "How charming." Turning, she put on a polite smile. "So unfortunate, the timing of your visit. My brother is not at home. I am Miss Bingley. This is my sister, Mrs. Hurst, and Mr. Darcy."
She paused for emphasis.
"Of Pemberley."
The younger woman appeared unimpressed. The older woman looked around the dining room in agitated dismay. Darcy had the grace to feel ashamed for Caroline Bingley's intentional snub. Miss Woodhouse, who was the younger of the two, came forward to take Caroline's hand. "How do you do?" She had a pleasant, musical voice. "Can it be that we are not expected, Miss Bingley?" To Darcy's surprise, Miss Woodhouse was smiling. Such directness was disarmingly awkward, and Caroline began to stammer an answer. Although Miss Woodhouse shared the colouring of Jane Bennet, she had none of Jane's gentle shyness. Here was no shabby country miss, but a well-heeled gentleman's daughter. "Mr. Bingley's invitation was as much a surprise to me as it apparently is to you. I suspect its origin is found not in your brother, Miss Bingley, but in Aunt Jane." "Who?" said Caroline faintly. "Great-Aunt Jane, our cousin on the Austen side. Surely you remember. We are related, you and I." Again Miss Woodhouse smiled. "Yes, very distantly." Caroline sought refuge from Miss Woodhouse's direct gaze by studying the invitation. "It came about in this way," continued Miss Woodhouse. "I received a letter from Aunt Jane describing a dilemma and requesting my help. I was obliged to refuse because of father. He is an invalid, you see, and he quite depends upon me. Next, I received your brother's kind invitation, and then Mr. Bertram, whom you shall meet presently, arrived with his cousin, Miss Price." "Such a helpful young woman, Miss Price," the other woman put in. "She is to look in on my own dear mamma from time to time." There was nothing affluent or fashionable about Miss Bates. Caroline Bingley gazed at her as if she were vermin. Miss Woodhouse went on with her story. "According to Mr. Bertram, our Aunt Jane commanded him, for there is no other word for it, to collect Miss Bates and me, and to bring us to you." "So that you may solve Aunt Jane's dilemma," said Darcy. Miss Woodhouse gave him a bright smile. "Yes, precisely." "But you cannot stay with us," protested Caroline. "We are about to leave for London." "Leave?" cried Miss Bates. "Oh, dear me, no. You cannot wish to leave dear Netherfield, not with 3 weeks left before Christmas." "What has that to do with anything?" Miss Woodhouse lowered her voice. "Why, no one spends Christmas in London if they can help it." "Christmastide," said Miss Bates, warming to her subject, "is the glory of the country estate. How wondrous this old house was at Christmas, with so much gaiety and so many parties. Poor dear grandpapa was very fond of parties, and gaming, and horse-racing, bless him." She twisted her fingers together as she talked. "These led to his downfall, and to ours as well, and to that most unfortunate shooting accident. But we had, oh, so many happy times here. Bless me, that was close on 40 years ago." "Here?" cried Caroline. "Were you in service, Miss, Bates?" Frumpy, faded Miss Bates drew back her shoulders. "You would not know it to look at me now, but at one time I was Miss Henrietta Bates of Netherfield Park." Silence filled the dining room. "There is a portrait of dear mamma on the wall just there. How pretty she is! And goodness, there should be a portrait of me, as a mere slip of a girl, up in the gallery." "With the frilled parasol," said Darcy politely. Miss Bates fairly beamed. "The very one. And now I have returned to Netherfield Park in time to keep Christmas." "But you cannot stay," cried Caroline Bingley. "Indeed you cannot." Miss Woodhouse collected the invitation and folded it. "I do not think we have a choice in the matter, Miss Bingley. Here we have come, and here we shall remain." Chapter 2. Jane Bennet paced the length of the bedchamber she shared with her sister. "Lizzie, I am so very sorry, truly." "It is not worth fretting about," said Elizabeth. "Chances are it is here in the house.
It will turn up. But it hasn't, said Jane mournfully, and I have looked everywhere. It was lost at the ball last night, I just know it. That clasp has always given me trouble. I should not have loaned it. I should not have borrowed it. Nonsense. You did not ask, I offered. Amethysts are the perfect complement to your gown. They were, said Jane with a sigh. Never mind. My bracelet will turn up somewhere. Somewhere at Netherfield. Netherfield. If Elizabeth did not see Netherfield ever again, it would be too soon. Last night's ball had been a disaster. In her mind's eye, she could see the clumsy attempts at dancing made by her cousin, Mr. Collins, and she could hear his boastful speeches too, as well as her younger sister's raucous laughter as they danced with the officers, and her mother's unwise and rather loud remarks made in the supper-room. The unholy glee of Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst, as they observed all this, was palpable. And then there was Mr. Darcy. True, she ought to have minded her tongue and left some things unsaid. But that expression of cold disdain, glittering in his dark eyes, she would not soon forget. It had been a horrid night, a wretchedly horrid night. I'll go down and write to Miss Bingley at once, said Jane, as she glanced at the window. It is not raining. Ned can take it. Elizabeth followed Jane out of the bedchamber and down the stairs. Writing a note is not the way to find a thing, she said. We must go to Netherfield ourselves. Jane came to a halt. Oh, Lizzie, I cannot. It would look as if I were grasping for a reason to, well, you know, to see Mr. Bingley again. Elizabeth could not keep back a smile. Mamma would approve. Jane's eyes found the floor. It is not like that. I am not chasing him, even though everyone says so. How mortifying to have Mamma's ambitions displayed so openly. I fear Mamma cannot help herself. Mr. Bingley is quite the perfect match for you. If only he were not so wealthy, for people will say, his wealth, interrupted Elizabeth, is part of his perfection. Lizzie, I am only funning, dearest. I tell you what, I will go in your stead to Netherfield. No one can say that I am setting my cap at Charles Bingley. But, Lizzie, believe me, I do not intend to force my presence on the Bingleys or the Hursts or Mr. Darcy. I had quite enough of their company when you were ill. I will ask at the service door for the housekeeper, and as I do not wish for Mamma to know of my errand, I will walk to Netherfield. But the weather, protested Jane. You saw for yourself that it does not rain. Have no fear. Everyone there will be asleep or at breakfast. The housekeeper will do all that is needed. I will be back before midday. You will see. But Netherfield's Mrs. Nichols was not of a mind to search. A little thing like that, miss. It could be anywhere. A very trying morning we've had. And then, because Elizabeth offered to help, she brought her up to search the supper-room and ball-room. She passed to Elizabeth a dry mop and a lamp. Mind, we've not cleaned, miss, not properly, you understand. Not with 2 ladies and a gentleman arriving on our doorstep this morning, fine as you please, demanding to be housed and fed. Mrs. Nichols drew back one of the heavy draperies, sending a shaft of light into the ballroom. Moreover, the mistress wishes to be packed up and gone as soon as may be, and the house closed for the season, all on the morning after the largest ball this neighbourhood has seen in years. It's enough to drive a body to drink. This from the dignified Mrs. Nichols. What else could Elizabeth do but thank the woman, and promise to stay out of her way? How forlorn the ballroom was, with empty chairs grouped in corners and along the walls. Last night it had been alive with light and music and conversation.
Now the glittering chandeliers were dark, the banks of flowers wilting. The air smelled of stale perfume. Elizabeth removed her pelisse, set her gloves and bonnet on a chair, and took up the dry mop. She would begin with the area near the musicians' gallery, and work through the room. Straightway she saw the value of Mrs. Nichols's lamp. By its light she found a button, several hairpins, and a spangled ribbon. The glitter of gold and amethysts was nowhere to be seen, but Elizabeth's memories shone bright. Here she had danced with Mr. Darcy. He had asked, and she did not refuse him. She ought to have done so. They had conversed together, and his answers were intelligent and even witty. Mr. Darcy was no fool, she gave him that, even during Jane's illness, which kept her confined to this house. She had been impressed with his conversation, and he danced surprisingly well. Here, too, she had danced with Mr. Collins. She had the bruised toes to prove it. The less she thought about him and his pompous conversation, the better. And here Jane fell in love with Charles Bingley. Elizabeth paused in her search and leaned against the long handle of the dry mop. Beautiful, gentle, good-hearted Jane had found a kind man worthy of her love. In this Elizabeth rejoiced with all her heart. Presently she heard the rattle of a latch, and the ballroom doors came open to admit someone. "Hello," a man's voice called. "Mrs. Hurst, is that you?" Elizabeth did not answer. She did not dare, because she recognized his voice. It was Mr. Darcy. "Who is there?" How like Mr. Darcy to be persistent. "It is I, Elizabeth Bennet," she said reluctantly. There, that would drive him away. But he did not go. He simply said, "Miss Bennet." And now an explanation was in order. "I am searching for my sister's bracelet, or rather my bracelet." She was babbling. Heaven help her, she was babbling. "It was lost at the ball last night. Mrs. Hurst is not here." "Have you searched the cloakroom?" This was an obvious location, but Elizabeth had not thought of it. "No, thank you for the suggestion." Instead of leaving, Mr. Darcy came toward her through the dimness. "What sort of bracelet is it?" "Amethysts set in gold. It is not a great loss. A mere trinket given me by my aunt and uncle Gardner. Jane borrowed it, you see, and she is distressed because last night it went missing." A gust of wind rattled the windows. The sky had darkened noticeably. The door came open. "Mr. Darcy," said a woman's pleasant voice, "have you found Mrs. Hurst? Oh, hello." "Miss Woodhouse, this is Miss Elizabeth Bennet." Mr. Darcy paused. "Is she also related to Aunt Jane?" Miss Woodhouse came forward in a decidedly friendly way, and held out a hand to Elizabeth. "Of course she is related. We all are. How do you do, Miss Bennet? Forgive me, from what Miss Bingley was saying, I thought your name would be Jane. She is my sister, and I should not shake hands, for mine is rather dirty. I am searching for a bracelet Jane lost at the ball." Emma grasped Elizabeth's hand anyway. "Then we must help you. Although I ought to find Mrs. Hurst, for Miss Bingley must be stopped. She cannot be allowed to leave Netherfield, not when Aunt Jane so clearly wishes her to be here." "Aunt Jane," said Darcy in a low voice, "is apparently some sort of guardian to us all." "That is very nicely said," agreed Miss Woodhouse. "It is most unwise to trifle with Aunt Jane. No good will come of it." A flash of lightning lit the room. In the near distance, thunder rolled. Rain began to beat against the window-glass. Elizabeth's heart sank. The minute she left Netherfield, she would be drenched to the skin. Apparently, Mr. Darcy noticed her dismay, for he looked a question. "Yes, Mr. Darcy.
said Elizabeth tartly. "As before, I scorned to use our carriage and walked." She gestured to the hem of her gown. "Behold the mud. I had hoped to make my search privately, without attracting notice." "You are stranded here," said Miss Woodhouse. "Then we must persuade Miss Bingley to ask you to dinner, which would be a very good thing. Mr. Bertram is becoming rather tiresome." "Oh, but Miss Woodhouse, do call me Emma. Will you help me to find Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley?" "Of course," said Elizabeth, "but I should tell you that Miss Bingley will not be pleased to see me." "Nonsense," said Emma. "Now, where could she and Mrs. Hurst be? The drawing-room is already wrapped up in holland cloth. Let us try the front parlour, a room Miss Bingley has set aside for receiving callers, most of whom she hopes will not come."
Darcy leaned in. She means guests from last night's ball, who will come to express their thanks. Miss Bingley wishes them at Jericho.
"Miss Bingley wishes to be at Jericho," said Emma pleasantly, "which I must say is a very apt description for London."
She waited at the door for Mr. Darcy to open it. Elizabeth came into the front parlour in time to hear Mr. Hurst bellow, "Have I seen you somewhere? One of the clubs. The name is familiar." A young man, dressed in what Elizabeth guessed to be very smart attire, was slouching against the mantelpiece. He straightened up and cleared his throat. "My father," he said, "is a member of White's, sir, but I prefer Boodle's. Fond of cards, are you? Whist, faro, queens?" The young man brightened. "I am a dab hand at hazard as well, sir, although the rules are devilish complex." "Oh-ho! Then we must have a game of whist, if we can find enough players. You there!" Mr. Hurst fixed a beady eye on Elizabeth. "You fond of cards?"
"I am afraid not, sir," she said, "no more than before."
"Ah, I remember you, the reader. Poh!" He swung around. "No use asking that gabble-monger," he said of a middle-aged lady seated by the window. "No use asking Darcy, either. Has to be Louisa, and, say," he eyed Emma, "do you play whist?"
"I play rather well, thank you," said Emma, "but at the moment I have no time for card games."
"Humph. Caroline will have to sit in. Now, where did she put the cards? Caroline!"
"There is no need to yell," said a muffled voice. Caroline Bingley was lying on one of the sofas. "I have no idea where your wretched cards are kept."
"You there, boy," Hurst called to a footman. "Find us a deck of cards and bring in a glass and a new bottle for, what did you say your name was?"
"Bertram. Tom Bertram. My father is—" There came a groan from Caroline. "For heaven's sake, speak more softly. My head aches dreadfully."
"And you would go to London today, would you, missy?" said Mr. Hurst to her. He turned to Mr. Bertram. "Well, boy, you were saying something about your father?"
"His name is Sir Thomas. Sir Thomas Bertram."
"And you're Tom, same as your father, eh, eldest son?"
"That's right."
"Come, take a seat, boy, and pit your skill against mine. And, Caroline, if you know what's good for you, you'll play whist with young Tom here. He's the eldest son."
Mr. Hurst gave a braying laugh. Emma leaned in. "Do you see why I am glad you have come, Elizabeth? What sort of people have we fallen in with? I fear they are not gentlefolk." Elizabeth bit her lip to keep from laughing. Had Mr. Darcy caught this remark? Yes, he certainly had. His expression was forbidding, but his eyes were alight with laughter. Somehow this gave her courage to approach the sofa. "Good morning, Miss Bingley," she said. "I am come to search for a missing bracelet. It was never my intention to disturb you, but Miss Woodhouse and Mr. Darcy insisted that I pay my respects." "How lovely!" Caroline's tone was arctic. Her gaze shifted to Elizabeth's hemline. "Dear me, Miss Elizabeth, is that mud quite dry?" "It is," said Elizabeth, although this bit here, she pointed to her smudged knee, is from your ballroom floor. When in the country, said Emma, one must expect a little mud now and again. Caroline rolled her eyes heavenward, and this did not escape Emma Woodhouse. Walking is a usual practice among resident landowners, she said. I often walk about our park, or in the shrubbery, or to and from dear Highbury. Walking, she added, seems rather odd to London people. I dare say that as you become accustomed to living on an estate, you will learn our ways. Caroline's flushed face became even redder. I'll have you know, she flashed, that... The parlour door came open with a bang. Hello! Called a cheerful voice. Here I am, home again. The bridge at Brunsley is washed out, can you believe it? So I had to turn back. Charles! Cried Caroline hoarsely. Nonsense, said Mr. Hurst. That bridge is made of stone. Been there since Roman times. The bridge is right as rain, said Charles. It's the road on either side that's washed out. The river's overrun its banks. Could you not, what is the expression, ford the river and press on, for you must go to London, wailed Caroline. Our plan. There's no crossing that river without a boat, dear girl, said Charles. No harm done. The water should be down in a day or two. Unless it continues to rain, Emma pointed out. I believe you are Mr. Bingley, the man who so kindly sent our invitation. How do you do? I am Emma Woodhouse of Hartfield. Charles Bingley looked rather startled. He was kept from answering because of clucking noises made by the middle-aged woman, who had deserted her post by the window. She now hovered over Caroline Bingley. My dear, she said, are you feeling quite well? I know it is not my place to say, but you look as if you are burning up with fever. My dear mother is prone to feverishness, so I know all about it. You ought to lie down again, with a damp cloth on your forehead. Is there someone here who can make a mustard plaster? Caroline, said Charles. I am fine, she insisted, but she lay back on the sofa cushions just the same. You do not look fine, her brother said. As this lady said, I beg your pardon, ma'am, I did not catch the name. This is Miss Bates, Charles, said Mr. Darcy, another of your invited guests. The gentleman is Mr. Tom Bertram. Of Mansfield Park, added Emma helpfully. Miss Bates laid her hand on Caroline's forehead. My dear child, you are burning up, positively burning up. And your cheeks. Caro, said Charles, your cheeks and your neck are swollen. Caroline's hands flew to her neck. They are not. Indeed they are, and very much so, said Miss Bates. And your head aches, you said so yourself. My dear, do you find it difficult to swallow? Caroline looked as if she were about to cry. Of course not, she rasped. We'll see about that, said Charles, and he snatched Mr. Hurst's wine-glass. Drink this, he told his sister. Elizabeth had to give Caroline Bingley credit. She did try to drink the wine. Of course, I am not a physician, and you must have your own medical man in this area, although I dare say he cannot compare with our dear Mr. Perry, babbled Miss Bates. It is a childhood illness, and you are not a child, but all the signs are present, indeed they are. I very much fear that you, Miss Bingley, have contracted the mumps. What? Shrieked Caroline, and then her eyes filled with tears, for her throat truly did pain her. Mrs. Hurst shrieked too. The mumps! How humiliating! Wailed Caroline. But I have never had the mumps, cried Mrs. Hurst. At least I do not think I have. And what if I am in the family way? Caroline wrinkled her nose. Oh, surely not. Mrs. Hurst gave her sister a look. It is possible, and I'll not take the risk. Thank you, Mr. Hurst, she called, We must leave at once. Bridge or no bridge, we must get away from here." "But Louisa," rasped Caroline. "I am very, very sorry, my dear, but it cannot be helped. We cannot host you for Christmas at Grosvenor Square this year. Come at Easter." She turned to her husband, who was deep in his card game with Tom Bertram. "Mr. Hurst!" she cried, and hurried from the room. He rose to his feet and cast his cards on the table.
"Just when I was winning," he complained. "First Charles steals my wine, and then I am cheated out of a game. And now," he added, "I must spend the night in some cursed coaching inn."
Mr. Hurst shambled off. The parlour door swung shut behind him. Elizabeth went up to Charles. "If I might importune the Hursts, Mr. Bingley," she said, "the lane passes quite near to Longbourn. If your sister is ill, I should not trespass upon your hospitality by remaining. It would be so very helpful if I am not obliged to walk home." "I'll see to it at once," said Charles. "Have you had the mumps, Elizabeth?" said Emma anxiously. "I believe so, yes. I do pity Caroline. I have heard that it is worse when one is older." And so it was that Elizabeth found herself deposited in front of Longbourn House, as the wind howled and rain stung her skin. The bright fire in the drawing-room soon set her to rights. "Rain and more rain," lamented Lydia, gazing out of the windows at the downpour. "I do hope the officers will come this evening. Denny and Wickham promised so faithfully." Elizabeth's lips compressed into a line. She had forgotten about Mr. Wickham, and the unjust treatment he had received at Mr. Darcy's hands. It was a very good thing to be gone from Netherfield. "No bracelet, alas," Elizabeth whispered to Jane, "but my search was interrupted. The housekeeper knows of it, and when the rooms are more thoroughly cleaned, I dare say the bracelet will be found." Jane's face crumpled. "Oh, Lizzie." Elizabeth put her arms around her sister. "Do not cry, dearest. It was an accident, and just think, poor Caroline has contracted the mumps." Mrs. Bennet came into the drawing-room, with Mr. Collins hard on her heels. "Lizzie, where have you been? Whose coach was that?" "I've been to Netherfield, mamma. The Hursts have kindly brought me home because of the rain." Mr. Collins cleared his throat.
"But that coach was loaded for travel."
"It was, yes." Elizabeth paused. "It so happens, mamma, that Caroline Bingley has contracted the mumps. Mrs. Hurst has not had it, so she and her husband were off at once."
"A most sensible thing," announced Mr. Collins. "We do not want mumps here."
Mrs. Bennet kept silent, gazing at Elizabeth and Jane.
"Mumps," she said at last, "spreads through a household like wildfire. The vilest thing."
"If that is so," said Elizabeth, "then it is likely that we have all had it." Mr. Collins's eyes narrowed.
"But are you certain? Because you, Miss Elizabeth, have brought disease into this house. And," he went on, "by embracing your sister, you have likely passed it to her."
"Mr. Collins."
"Communicable disease is treacherous," he warned. "How it spreads from person to person is a mystery, but it is nothing to be trifled with."
"Why, that is very true," cried Mrs. Bennet. "Lizzie, what have you done?" "Mamma, we had the mumps as babies." "Did you? We dare not take the risk. I agree with Mrs. Hurst, whom I have always thought to be a most prudent, sensible woman. You cannot stay here, either of you." "What do you mean?" "If there is mumps at Netherfield, then to Netherfield you must return." "Mamma, you cannot be serious." Mrs. Bennet gave the bell-pull a series of tugs. "Hile will pack your things, girls, and Ned will drive you to Netherfield in the carriage." "In the middle of a storm?" "Indeed, yes. What do the Bingleys mean by passing this highly contagious illness to you, and then sending you home like so much baggage? There you are, Hile. We need Jane's and Lizzie's best gowns and night things packed up right away. Enough for 3 weeks.
Mamma, no.
For 3 weeks, repeated Mrs. Bennet. Do you think a mother forgets how long her babies were ill? Mumps runs its course in 3 weeks, if we are lucky. She added with a smile, Perhaps you will be well again by the new year. Chapter 3. Not for the first time did Darcy wonder why he had become friends with the Bingleys. Charles was the best of fellows, but his sisters, what noise and nuisance! Neither of them possessed true elegance of mind, only a pretension and posturing. Hurst was little better than a gamester. He would run through Louisa's fortune soon enough, while she clung to social ambition, as did her sister Caroline. Darcy's lips twisted into a rueful smile. How right his grandmother had been. An ape's an ape, a varlet's a varlet, though they be clad in silk or scarlet. Well, Caroline had taken to her bed, and the Hursts were gone away to their house in London. Darcy's plan to part Charles from Jane Bennet was thwarted, but at least there would be quiet in the house. As soon as the roads permitted, he would leave Netherfield. Charles and Caroline must remain until the new year, for where would they go? There would be no celebrating Christmas with the Hursts. But will she press me for an invitation to Pemberley? Ha! Said Darcy aloud. He'd see that. Caroline Bingley had matrimonial ambitions, not only for herself but also for her brother, as if his fortune made Bingley an acceptable husband for Georgiana. That alliance would be as unequal as one between himself and, say, Elizabeth Bennet, which was plainly ridiculous. Elizabeth thoroughly disliked him, and no wonder. She'd believed whatever lies Wickham had told. Curse the fellow, he was never at a loss. The longer Wickham remained in Meryton, the more lies he would invent. Eventually the truth, and his debts, would cause him to flee, as a rat abandons a sinking ship. Even so, Elizabeth Bennet would be difficult to forget. He'd seldom encountered so much intelligence and beauty, and, to give it a name, sincerity, in a young woman. Moreover, she was refreshingly uninterested in pursuing him. And then Darcy heard something. Miss Bates, having seen Caroline put to bed upstairs, talking all the while, Miss Bates was now wandering the hallways of the first floor, singing. Her thin voice came warbling up the stairwell. Christmas is coming, the geese are getting fat. Please put a penny in the old man's hat. If you haven't got a penny, a halfpenny will do. There were a good 3 weeks until Christmas, and if she meant to keep singing that song... Darcy made for the safety of the library, and hastily closed the door behind him. Bingley was in a chair before the fire. He looked up with a smile. "If you haven't got a halfpenny," said Darcy to Charles, "then God bless you." "If I haven't got a what?" "It's Miss Bates," said Darcy shortly. "She is not only anticipating Christmas, she is speeding the day by singing about it." He paused. God only knows what she is doing here. Bingley's smile disappeared. From a pocket he pulled a folded paper. "Here is Miss Woodhouse's invitation. I cannot understand it. This is my handwriting, but—" His eyes were pleading. "Darcy, I swear to you, I never wrote this letter." Darcy pulled forward a chair. Thus we are left with Miss Woodhouse's theory of Aunt Jane. Is there such a person? Miss Woodhouse says so. According to Miss Bates, we are to celebrate Christmas together, observing all the old traditions. You are welcome in my house at any time, Darcy, but— I am afraid not, old fellow. Georgiana waits for me to come to London, and we will travel north together. We will spend Christmas, as we always have, at Pemberley.
Bingley passed a hand over his eyes. Why have these people come? More to the point, how am I to be rid of them? If the bridge at Brunsley is under water, then— Darcy was interrupted by a knock at the library door. He and Bingley exchanged a look. "Come," called Bingley. To Darcy's relief, it was Emma Woodhouse who entered, not Miss Bates. She was followed closely by two others. Darcy rose to his feet, and then he heard Bingley's gasp of recognition. "Jane!" Charles cried. "Miss Bennet!" There was no mistaking the joy in Bingley's voice. And then Darcy saw Elizabeth. His heart began to hammer. Am I a schoolboy that she should have this effect on me? Yet he was powerless to do anything other than gaze at her. "I am sorry to disturb," said Emma cheerfully, "but things have sorted out in a most interesting way." Jane and Elizabeth were looking as flushed and uncomfortable as Darcy felt. "It's Mamma," stammered Jane, close to tears. "Oh, Mr. Bingley, I was never so mortified. Indeed, I hardly know how to look you in the face." Darcy glanced at Bingley. He looked as if he wished to take Jane into his arms. To prevent this, Darcy stepped forward. "Is Mrs. Bennet ill?" he said. She has. Elizabeth spoke up. "It's this matter of the mumps. Because I was here this morning, Mamma believes that I have contracted the disease, and because I embraced Jane, I have supposedly passed it to her." She hesitated. "And therefore," Emma put in, "Mrs. Bennet does not wish to expose the family. She has sent Elizabeth and Jane to stay here while the sickness runs its course. Is this not delightful?" "Oh, yes," cried Bingley. "Indeed it is." Elizabeth living here for several weeks. Darcy felt his mouth go dry. This was not good news. Why then was his heart rejoicing? "But the imposition," said Jane. "I would not put you out for the world." Bingley spread his hands. "Darcy and I were just discussing Christmas. The bridge is out. We have nowhere to go." "Actually," Darcy began, and then stopped himself. "We shall celebrate the season together," cried Bingley. Together for Christmas. That Charles would be in Jane's company was bad enough, but he and Elizabeth— "Ring the bell, Darcy, will you?" said Bingley. "We must tell Mrs. Nichols to set 2 more places at dinner. Indeed, for every meal." But before Darcy could obey, Bingley called him back. "We'll tell her ourselves. That would be simpler, eh?" He offered his arm to Jane Bennet. "I'm informed by Miss Bates," he said, "that we ought to observe Christmas with all the old traditions of Netherfield. The first Sunday of Advent is almost here. That is when we make the puddings, is it not?" The library door banged closed behind them. Darcy found himself alone with Miss Woodhouse and Elizabeth. Miss Woodhouse was busy examining the bookshelves. "Mr. Darcy," she said, "do you know whether Mr. Bingley has a copy of Debrett's?" She looked over her shoulder at Elizabeth. "It is a guidebook for the peerage. Surely Miss Bingley has one?" she said before Darcy could answer. "Depend upon it, she means to marry well. Aha, here we are." Emma removed the book from its shelf and brought it to a table. "Something Mr. Hurst said interests me." She smiled at Elizabeth. "He is a funny one, is he not? The sort of person my brother-in-law would call a rumman." "A what?" The words were out before Darcy could stop them. Hurst certainly was, but— Elizabeth's eyes met his. She gave a gurgle of laughter. Emma was untroubled. "He seems to be a most peculiar person. My brother-in-law will talk like that, because he is fond of jests and word-play. I dare say it is also because he is a barrister. Mind, he is quite well-to-do, being a knightly of Donwell Abbey. But such is the lot of a gentleman's younger son. He must have a profession." "My Uncle Gardner," said Elizabeth.
is in the same situation. He is in trade." She said this with a lift of her chin and a glance in Darcy's direction, as if it were a challenge. What did she mean by it? Emma continued to turn pages. "But who is Sir Thomas Bertram? That is the question, because young Tom is not a younger son, and so his presence becomes, shall we say, interesting." Darcy did not care for her implication. "In what way?" he said. Emma gave him an ingenious smile. "I specialize in matchmaking." She specialized in what? Somehow Darcy managed to keep his countenance. "It is a most amusing occupation," continued Emma. "My first was ever so successful. My former governess, and old Mr. Weston. They are happily settled at Randall's now." "How nice for your governess," said Elizabeth. "She is the dearest creature, and quite the gentlewoman, as the best governesses always are. I have another match in progress between my friend Harriet and our vicar. I do worry, however, because I am away. Matches, you see, need helping along."
"So I am given to understand," said Darcy dryly. "A matchmaker in their midst. What next?" Then again, why should he object? Because dinner, without Caroline's repressive formality, was refreshingly agreeable. Charles sat in his place, and the others chose seats as they wished. Jane shyly slipped into a chair at Bingley's right, with Mr. Bertram beside her. Elizabeth sat at Bingley's left. Darcy could not help himself. He claimed the chair next to Elizabeth's. That meant that he had Miss Bates on his other side, but she was content to talk across the table to Mr. Bertram and Emma. Darcy hid a smile. Miss Bates could carry a conversation on her own, without stopping to draw breath. And the wind and rain continued to beat against the house. This meant that the bridge was still out. Darcy, imprisoned at Netherfield against his will, was forced to endure lovely, intelligent Elizabeth Bennet as his dinner partner. It was all he could do to keep a foolish smile from his lips. This time he would speak without stiffness or pretension. If Emma Woodhouse meant to match Elizabeth with Tom Bertram, she would have a fight on her hands. After dinner, Charles was intent on receiving the stream of callers his sister had predicted, and so he cheerfully led the entire party to the drawing-room. But word must have spread that there was sickness at Netherfield, or else the storm kept people at home. Only one person was waiting for them, Mr. Collins. He rose to his feet. "My dear Mr. Bingley," he began with impressive formality. Still talking, Miss Bates came into the room, without noticing Mr. Collins. "Now then," she said, striking her hands together, "Christmas is a time for merrymaking, so we must play games in keeping with the holiday spirit." "What sort of games?" Tom Bertram wanted to know. "Whist, loo? Better yet, shall we set up a faro bank?" "Goodness, no. Children's games, Mr. Bertram, the very best kind. Grandpapa and his friends were especially fond of charades." "My dear Mr. Bingley," began Mr. Collins again. "Does anyone know how to play how, why, when, or where?" said Emma. "A game of questions," said Bingley. "Famous. Do teach us." "Mr. Bingley," repeated Mr. Collins. "My good fellow," said Bingley, "do sit down and enjoy yourself." "Since there are so many of us, what about Reverend Crawley's game?" said Miss Bates. "It is always most amusing, and not nearly as fatiguing as guessing. To play we must stand in a circle." "Oh, yes," cried Emma. "Let's do." Immediately, Darcy was on his guard. He had played this one before. Apparently Collins had too, for his expression was eager. "We link hands," said Miss Bates, "but not with those on either side, or not both hands with the same person. And then we must untangle ourselves, but without letting go of the hands you are holding."
Untangle ourselves, said Elizabeth, laughing. But how? We will be an enormous human knot. Vividly, Darcy recalled the twisting and turning and stepping through, often at very close quarters. Collins and Tom Bertram must not be allowed to come smash up against Elizabeth Bennet like that. He raised his voice about the babble. What about dancing instead? Had he truly suggested this? But the word dancing acted like magic. Darcy was voted a capital fellow. Bingley and Bertram began rolling back the carpet. Will you play for us, Miss Bates? Darcy inquired. Oh, my, bless me, she fluttered and clucked. I have not played in a good many years, not since I was a girl, a very long while ago. I will play, said Emma, and she opened the pianoforte. You must dance, Miss Bates. Country dances, she added, over Miss Bates's objections. I'm sure you remember how. She spread her fingers over the keys and played an opening chord. Darcy took hold of Elizabeth's hand. Do me the honour, he said in a low voice. You suffered enough last night with Mr. Collins. Elizabeth's startled eyes met his. He could see the refusal forming on her lips. He is coming this way, Darcy murmured. Elizabeth looked around. Sure enough, Collins was already making his bow. My dear, dear cousin Eliza, he said, will you do me the honour, as I have come all this way just to speak with you? Darcy saw Elizabeth stiffen. I beg your pardon, she said. I am, as you see, engaged to Mr. Darcy. Darcy's brows went up. He grinned, and she broke out laughing. Too late, Mr. Collins, he said smoothly. Dance with Miss Bates instead. Tom Bertram was left standing to the side, blinking. What we ought to do, he said stubbornly, is set up a faro bank. Usually, Elizabeth enjoyed dancing, but at a private assembly or ball, where there were many partners from which to choose. Here, with 4 gentlemen and 3 ladies, it was more awkward. After dancing a set with Mr. Darcy, Elizabeth went directly to Mr. Bertram, knowing he would ask. After that, she planned to dance with Charles Bingley. Unfortunately, Mr. Collins edged in. I thank you for the honour, she told him, but I ought to relieve Miss Woodhouse at the pianoforte. After that, Mrs. Nichols brought in refreshments, and Elizabeth fled the drawing-room. Would Mr. Collins follow, or would he be occupied with coffee and cake? Across from the drawing-room were the double doors to the ballroom. Elizabeth pulled one open and slipped inside. Inside it was dark and chilly. Rain beat against the tall windows like fingers drumming on a table. Elizabeth pressed her back against the wall. Surely her busy cousin would not follow her here. Surely he would remember that she had been exposed to sickness. Why, oh why, did Mr. Collins come to Netherfield? Moments later, the door opened to admit a gentleman carrying a candlestick. When she saw who it was, Elizabeth let out a sigh of relief. Mr. Darcy, she whispered, how you startled me. Is something wrong? It is so close to the drawing-room, she said. A weak excuse, but it was the best she could do. Please close the door before my cousin. Mr. Darcy did so at once, but he remained inside. Why did he not go out? Elizabeth turned her gaze away from him, and then, by the light of his candle, she noticed something. There, on the far side of the ballroom, a glittering. What is that? Just there. Do you see the sparkle on the floor? Hold up the candle, please. He did so. Could it be my bracelet, under that collection of, what are they, chairs? Do you see? Together they crossed the ballroom, their footfalls echoing on the bare floor.
Mr. Darcy gave Elizabeth the candle, pushed the chairs aside, and knelt to reach under a sofa. Behind them, the drawing-room door came creaking open. "You who?" a voice called. "Miss Elizabeth?" It was Mr. Collins. "What luck to find you here. Are you quite well, fair cousin?" Elizabeth closed her eyes. "A trifle overheated, that is all," she called back. "I am not ill, if that is what you are wondering. Your mamma did mention that you have already had the mumps." Her busy mother's tactics were thus exposed, and before Mr. Darcy of all people. Elizabeth felt a flush rise to her cheeks. "I wonder that you would dare risk coming here," she said to Mr. Collins. "I was a bit over-hasty in my advice, for most people have had the mumps, have they not?" He hesitated, and then gave an awkward laugh. Elizabeth suppressed a shudder. She could picture him moistening his lips. "It was in order to solicit a private interview with you that I have come," he said, "and Providence has granted my wish." Any honest answer Elizabeth could give would not be helpful, so she merely said, "So it would seem." "It is very dark in here," Mr. Collins pointed out. Elizabeth glanced at Darcy. From his kneeling position he gazed up at her. She could see questions glittering in his eyes. "Don't you dare move," she whispered, and she held the candlestick higher. "What is it you wish to say to me, cousin?" she called, more loudly. "Have you come to ask for a dance?" Mr. Collins gave a little giggle. "Now that you mention it, yes. But, come, you can hardly doubt the true purpose of my call. My attentions have been too marked to be mistaken." Elizabeth held back a sigh, and courageously crossed the room. She had been fearing a declaration for days. Behind her came a noise, rather like a cough. Mr. Darcy. Of course, Mr. Collins would continue to talk. "Almost as soon as I entered Longbourn House," he said, "I singled you out as the companion of my future life." So here it was, a proposal made with that pulpit-trained voice. It penetrated to every corner of the room, and he was smiling. Elizabeth could see the glint of his teeth. "Perhaps it would be advisable," he went on, "if I state my reasons for marrying. For you must know that I came into Hertfordshire with the design of selecting a wife." "Mr. Collins," said Elizabeth repressively, but his enthusiasm would not be deterred. "First, I think marriage a right thing for every clergyman in easy circumstances. Second, it will add very greatly to my happiness. And thirdly—" Was he preaching a sermon, listing his reasons as one would draw up a list for the village shops? "And thirdly," he repeated, smiling more widely, "it is the express wish of my noble patroness, Lady Catherine de Bourgh." "In other words," said Elizabeth, "you have been commanded to marry." He gave an awkward laugh. "You may have your little jest, but I am in earnest, dear cousin. Because I am to inherit the Longbourn estate after the death of your honoured father, I resolved to choose a wife from among his daughters, that the loss to them might be as little as possible when the melancholy event takes place." "You wish to marry me out of pity, sir?" His smile disappeared. "Why, no, certainly not." By the light of the candle, Elizabeth could see the mulish set of his chin. "You," he said solemnly, "being the fairest and cleverest of your sisters, possessing both wit and vivacity, have caught my eye. My motive stems from chivalry, fair cousin, a fine and selfless purpose which is to mitigate the evils of the entail. I flatter myself it will not sink me in your esteem." In other words, Mr. Collins wished to assuage his guilt of casting his female cousins from their home. "I am sensible of the honour of your proposals," she began. "However—" Again he interrupted. "As to fortune, I am perfectly indifferent. I shall make no demand of that nature on your father, since I am well aware that it could not possibly be complied with. £1,000, yours after your mother's decease, is all that you may ever be entitled to." Must he insult her by pointing out her deficiencies? A noise in the far corner reminded her that Mr. Darcy was listening. Mr. Collins added, with an air of awkward gallantry, "Rest assured, no ungenerous reproach shall ever pass my lips once we are married." This was a bald-faced lie. He was reproaching her, even as he proposed. "I am sorry to give you pain," said Elizabeth carefully, "and I thank you for the compliment you are paying me. But I am convinced that we shall not suit. Moreover, at the present time, I have no intention of marrying." "None at all? Nonsense! Will you become like that haggish spinster in the drawing-room? The laughing-stock of Meryton, supported by the charity of friends? Come now." Mr. Collins rubbed his hands together. "I am well aware that it is usual with young ladies to reject the addresses of a man whom they secretly mean to accept." From the corner of the room was a loud clattering, as items of furniture, the chairs, were being tossed aside. Mr. Darcy came striding through the darkness, smash up to Mr. Collins. Elizabeth's candle threw Mr. Darcy's features into sharp relief. "The lady," he said sternly, "has told you no." Mr. Collins gave a scream. "What are you doing here?" "That," said Mr. Darcy, "is beside the point. As a clergyman and a gentleman, it is now your part to thank her for her time. But— and then take yourself off at once." Mr. Collins looked from Elizabeth to Mr. Darcy, and back again. His face was twitching like a rabbit's. Mr. Darcy turned to Elizabeth. "If this person continues to trouble you, say the word, and I will gladly throw him from the house." Elizabeth's eyes widened in surprise. "Could you?" "Now or at any time," he said promptly, "and with the greatest pleasure." This remark was answered by hurried footfalls and the slam of the ballroom door. So much for Mr. Collins' courage. Elizabeth nearly collapsed with relief. "Thank God," she cried. "And if you dare breathe a word of this to anyone—" "Your secret is safe with me, and most especially from Miss Woodhouse, our resident matchmaker." "Good gracious," said Elizabeth. "She cannot mean to match me with Mr. Collins." "I think not. Besides, you have cut the ground from beneath her feet rather neatly. Your cousin will not be renewing his addresses." "I devoutly hope that you are right. I am ashamed that you had to listen to all that." Mr. Darcy's grim expression dissolved into a grin. "I have never yet had the occasion to propose to a lady," he told her. "But now, thanks to Mr. Collins, I know precisely what not to do." "Oh dear, he was rather insulting, was he not?" "As to Miss Woodhouse, you are not the only sufferer. No doubt she has a match in mind for me as well." "Not Miss Bingley," said Elizabeth, before she could stop herself. His eyes met hers, but they were smiling. "Definitely not Miss Bingley." There was a pause. "Shall we sit for a moment? There is something I would like to talk over with you." He stepped away, and Elizabeth heard the scrape of chairs being brought forward. She sat in the one he placed for her, and he set the candlestick on the floor between them. His handsome face was now lit from beneath, rather like a ghoul's. while fantastic shapes danced on the ceiling, and yet somehow it was easier to face Mr. Darcy like this, half hidden by shadows. He sat silent, with his hands on his lap. Elizabeth noticed that the tips of his fingers touched one another. "Miss Elizabeth," he said suddenly, "who or what is Aunt Jane?" Chapter 5. Darcy saw Elizabeth's expression change, and instantly he regretted his words. Here he was, in a darkened room with her, a most excellent state of affairs, his cousin Fitz would say, and what must he do but spout the first foolish thought that came into his head? Why couldn't he converse about the weather? It was raining hard enough to wake the dead. He felt his lips twist into a rueful smile. "You must think me quite mad, Miss Elizabeth. Indeed, I hardly know how to explain what I mean." She returned his smile. A singularly beautiful smile, he thought. It was sincere and engaging, with none of Caroline Bingley's tight politeness. "You are not yet a candidate for Bedlam," she pointed out. "Although I dare say, if it continues to storm for the next fortnight, we shall each be joining you there." "We'll fill a van," he agreed. "What I said about Aunt Jane is unimportant. I was thinking aloud. A profitable way to occupy your time." The lifted brow, the twinkle in her eyes. Under the spell of her charm, Darcy could feel his reserve evaporating. "Oh, certainly," he quipped. "I babble nonsense, thereby causing my friends to look askance or leave the room. Most productive." "I promise to do no such thing, Mr. Darcy. Pray continue. I would like to hear what you have to say about Aunt Jane." Her tone was decidedly friendly. Perhaps he should risk it. Moreover, this was a prime setting for speaking freely, and yet, "After all," she went on, "you can scarcely embarrass yourself more than I have embarrassed myself tonight." "Upon my word," Darcy burst out, "do you consider your cousin's actions to be your fault?" "No," she said slowly, "but as he is my relation—" "You are responsible for nothing that he does. As for relations, I dare say every family has a Collins or two. We certainly have. I have promised to forget what happened earlier, so I suggest that you do the same. Now then, let us discuss Aunt Jane." The candlelight enhanced the anticipation in her gaze. Darcy drew a long breath and began. "Have you had someone in your life who was, how shall I say it, a deuced managing busybody?" "Indeed, yes," she said promptly. "Mr. Collins fills the role admirably." Darcy gave her a look. "I had in mind someone like a governess," he said lightly, "or a steward, or a groom. A masterful sort of person whom it is impossible to get round." "It wouldn't be a groom. I have never learned to ride." "I'll teach you." Darcy blinked. Where had this thought come from? "But I do know what you mean," she went on. He worked to regain his composure. No more stray thoughts. Moreover, he must take special care not to embarrass her. "What I mean to say is, have you ever had the suspicion that you are being managed by a force outside yourself?" "Do you mean being compelled to take a certain course of action? Such as," she added, twinkling, "how we must all remain here until Christmas, by order of this Aunt Jane?" "Exactly. The rainfall, and the bridge, and the mumps have conspired together." She tilted her head. "Coincidence?" "I would be inclined to agree, if it were not for the letter. Charles Bingley claims that he never wrote the invitation that brought Miss Woodhouse and her friends here."
How very odd.
Isn't it? I've seen the letter. The writing is his. Elizabeth's brow furrowed.
Perhaps he did write, and then forgot.
I devoutly hope so, Miss Elizabeth. Darcy leaned forward. And yet my own experiences cause me to wonder. He paused. She would certainly think him mad if he continued. And yet the temptation to confide in her was almost overmastering.
Yes,
she said.
Do go on.
Darcy cast caution to the winds and plunged ahead. Have you ever taken matters into your own hands, run with an impulse? And then, quite suddenly, it is as if the situation is erased, and you discover that you are back where you were originally, that what you did has simply disappeared. She did not answer right away, and he liked her for it. At length she said,
Perhaps you dreamed it.
If only he had. But Elizabeth was intent. She wished to understand him. There was nothing scornful in her tone. He could not resist. He must continue. I have wondered that, yes, said Darcy. But I recall the erased events vividly. He hesitated. This is a faulty metaphor, but it is as if pages were removed from a storybook.
Are you one of the characters in the story? She said, smiling. Perhaps what you are referring to is an act of God.
Darcy returned her smile. Ah, but he has a very different view. We worship and pray. We confess and are forgiven. But this other, this manager, merely alters things, rather ineptly sometimes, not at all like the Almighty would.
Then it must be coincidence.
Like coincidence in a storybook, he countered. There are rather too many of those to be believable. Cinderella loses a slipper, and it fits no one else in the kingdom. Sleeping Beauty is kissed by a prince, not licked by a hedge pig. Beauty returns just as the beast is dying.
Or a letter is delivered at a critical moment,
suggested Elizabeth. Precisely. A letter did come just before Wickham ran off with my... Darcy stopped, aghast at what he had been about to say.
Dear me, is even Mr. Wickham under your manager's command?
Elizabeth sounded amused. Darcy felt his jaw tense. Apparently so, he said stiffly. He saw her eyes widen in surprise.
I do not follow you,
she said slowly. Of course she did not. She would never understand unless he was specific, and that meant being forthright. There were risks with complete frankness. On the other hand, perhaps it was well that Elizabeth learned the truth about Wickham. Look here, he said, showing her the knuckles of his right hand. A year ago April I had an, altercation with George Wickham, wherein his nose and jaw were broken. He heard her intake of breath.
Broken by you?
He shrugged. What else could he do? Behold the scar. Her eyes blazed into his.
Of all the unjust, hateful, barbaric...
Darcy cut her short. I had my reasons, Miss Elizabeth. Wickham attempted an elopement with my... Again he stopped. Georgiana must be kept out of this. I arrived in time to confront him face to face. The elopement was halted by me. Elizabeth pressed her hands to her cheeks.
An elopement? She repeated. Oh, this does not sound like him at all.
He stood to gain a substantial fortune. But I digress. The point is not that I hit him, but that after I did so, I found myself back at Pemberley. It was as if I'd never gone to Ramsgate at all.
But you did hit him.
In truth, he said ruefully, it was rather worse than that. He struck his head sharply as he fell. The amount of blood was ghastly. So you killed him? To be honest, I do not know. As I told you, almost at once, I was back at Pemberley. When I did journey to Ramsgate for the second time, which had somehow become the first, I arrived 2 days earlier than before. There was no confrontation then, for Wickham had not yet come. A happy circumstance, cried Elizabeth. For the state of his face, yes, I must confess, Darcy admitted. I brought a pistol that second time, for I had every intention of shooting him. Instead, I merely wrote a letter. I negotiated a settlement, for I had my sister... Blast his unruly tongue. I had the reputation of another to consider, he amended. I did not wish to broadcast his infamy to the world, on account of her. But here is the curious thing. The scar made when I struck Wickham remains, do you see? To Elizabeth's credit, she leaned in to study the back of his hand. When next you see Wickham, Darcy added, you might notice the slight notch to his left ear, made by my ring. You say you hit him, said Elizabeth, but it turns out that you did not. The managing force, Miss Woodhouse's Aunt Jane, if you will, stepped in and changed things. But she forgot a few details, such as to the cut in my fist and to Wickham's ear. He saw her doubt, and yet she was not dismissive, and this same force is at work here. I believe so, yes. Stopping something from happening, or else rearranging something that has already happened. Darcy felt his cheeks grow warm. How fortunate for the concealing shadows. I believe it is the former. To be frank, yesterday afternoon I was to travel to London, he said, and my intent was to keep Charles Bingley there for as long as possible. He saw Elizabeth consider his words. He also saw irritation flash in her eyes. To keep him there, she repeated, in spite of his growing affection for my Jane. You wished to keep them apart? To be fair, I saw little evidence of her regard for him. You saw little? Oh, how blind you are! If I am blind, he countered, then you are naive. You have no idea the number of women who have pursued Charles Bingley simply for his fortune. He has an affectionate heart. I have often seen him in love. Can you blame me for assuming that your sister had mercenary designs? I can, and I do, she cried. Jane sincerely loves him. He is not a prize to be won. Now that I have seen them together, Darcy said more mildly, I am inclined to believe you. Who made you an authority on... She stopped. Oh, you approve of the match? Darcy had to smile. Let us say that I have revised my opinion somewhat. They seem to be well suited, he said, and she does sincerely care for him. But I believe Miss Woodhouse is to be the final authority. Give me your left hand. He saw her quick intake of breath, and the surprise in her eyes as her gaze flew to his. Slowly she put out her hand. Darcy realized his gaffe, and hid a smile. The poor girl. Did she think he was offering her a ring? And yet she held out her hand to him. Darcy felt the blood rush to his face. He lightly clasped Elizabeth's wrist, and from a pocket brought out the missing bracelet. I believe it is the left you favour for bracelets, is it not? You wore this at Sir William Lucas's party, as I recall. Yes, she said a little breathlessly. But how did you... Darcy ignored the question, as he enjoyed the warmth of her. This is rather pretty, he said, and he opened the clasp. It is fortunate that you noticed it there in the corner. Thank you. He frowned over the clasp. The latch appears to be broken. Shall I ride into Meryton and have it looked at? Is there someone with the skill to mend this?
I do not know. Perhaps Mr. Wade, who looks after clocks and timepieces. But there is no need, Mr. Darcy, truly. It is not altogether broken. I know to be careful when wearing it.
She leaned in, and he inhaled her scent.
Do you see, just here, she said, how the catch?
The drawing-room door came roughly open. Bingley came in, with Jane close behind.
There you are, he crowed. We've been looking everywhere.
Darcy kept a light hold on Elizabeth Bennet's wrist. He felt her pulse quicken.
Do not move, he murmured. Brazen it out.
What's all this? Alone together, and holding hands, are you?
You have been reading too many novels, Charles, said Darcy lightly.
He released Elizabeth's wrist. Behind them edged Miss Bates, Emma Woodhouse, and Tom Bertram.
This is very nice, I must say, quipped Bingley. My sister is not here to act as a duenna, and what must the pair of you do but slip away together?
I was helping to locate Miss Elizabeth's lost bracelet, said Darcy evenly, and here it is.
Mr. Collins was with us,
Elizabeth hastened to say,
until very recently.
Bingley was smiling widely.
Alone, said he, with a single candle between you. Indicative, highly indicative.
Darcy refused to rise to the bait, staring down even Miss Woodhouse's interested gaze. He rose to his feet and assisted Elizabeth to do the same. She hesitated, and then placed her hand lightly on his proffered arm.
We shall never hear the end of this,
he confided in a low voice, as they left the drawing-room together. But it could be worse, you know. She looked an inquiry. I could be Collins.
Oh, you,
she whispered. Was a playful blow to the arm a good thing? Darcy rather hoped it was. Chapter 6. Into the drawing-room they trooped together, with Mr. Bingley teasing his friend all the while. Elizabeth concealed a sigh. She and Mr. Darcy would never live this down. And what must Mr. Darcy do but take the chair beside hers?
It is the only way to silence him, he murmured.
By confirming his suspicions, she whispered back.
No, we spike his guns by playing along.
Would you care for coffee? Miss Bates's clucking voice rose above the conversation of the others, like a hen marshalling her chicks.
What say you to a round of spillikins?
Another noisy game. It would be a welcome diversion, but she dared not glance at Mr. Darcy to see what he thought. From the corner of her eye, Elizabeth saw him rise to his feet. He placed a small table before her, and then came back with the backgammon board.
Shall we play a game?
He said pleasantly, moving his chair to face hers.
No,
she whispered urgently.
We shall never hear the end of it.
His response was to open the board and begin placing the checkers. When everyone sees how thoroughly you are trounced, Miss Elizabeth, speculation of a romance between us shall cease.
Trounced?
Elizabeth lifted her chin.
If I do agree to play, I have no intention of losing, sir.
Mr. Darcy's eyes glittered. We'll see about that.
Elizabeth discovered that she was smiling. I'll have you know that I am rather good at backgammon.
Ah, but are you good enough?
Was he taunting her? Silent, taciturn Mr. Darcy? And there was more. When he smiled, his cheeks dimpled attractively. Why had she never noticed this? I am not afraid of you, sir, she countered.
You should be, he said, and he held out her dice. What could she do but take them? Her bare fingers brushed against his palm. On guard, Miss Elizabeth, he said. Did he think to confound her with fencing cant? He would soon discover that she was no green girl. "Allez, Mr. Darcy," she smilingly retorted, and boldly tossed the dice onto the board. It was very late when the party broke up. What an evening! Mr. Darcy was a formidable opponent, but Elizabeth held her own. Best 2 out of 3 became best 3 out of 4, and they ended in a tie. Backgammon might not serve to quell gossip, but it had been most entertaining. And the storm continued to batter the house. Elizabeth was never more grateful for warmed sheets, and for the cheerful fire in her bedchamber, by Longbourn standards a luxury. Lulled by the pattering of raindrops against the window-glass, she settled into sleep. Some hours later a clock chimed. Not there in the room. It was the long-case clock in the passageway. Elizabeth shifted in bed, pulling the blankets higher. It was still raining out, but there was light in the bedchamber. Elizabeth opened an eye. Sure enough, her candlestick was lit. She knew she had blown it out earlier, and yet there it was. Moreover, Elizabeth discovered that she was propped up in bed. In her hands she held a book. Had she been reading? She turned the spine to see the title, but the lettering was indistinct. It occurred to her that she was waiting. But for what? Or for whom? Footfalls sounded in the passageway, and then the door slowly came open. Whoever it was carried a candle. She could see its light advancing into the room. Elizabeth felt herself close the book, a smile hovering on her lips. It was a man who entered, and she felt no apprehension. He kept his back toward the bed, as if using his body to shield the candlelight. "You are in rather late," she heard herself say. "Did you enjoy your evening?"
"Elizabeth, have you been waiting up all this time? I did not wish to."
He put down the candlestick and laid his greatcoat on the chair.
"It must be almost 3.
He turned, smiling an apology. It was then that Elizabeth saw his face. It was Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy in her bedchamber. Elizabeth heard her voice calmly say, "I do not mind. I could not sleep." He pulled his timepiece from his waistcoat pocket and studied it with a groan.
"It's terribly late. In the first place, dinner was delayed, not that it mattered to us, and after that, well—"
He shrugged off the frock-coat and unknotted his cravat.
"You know how these Navy fellows are. Each had to tell his favourite story," he said,
embellished with new and barely factual details. She watched him unbutton his waistcoat. It joined the pile on the chair. There were tales of India and Portugal, and several prosed on about, he deepened his voice, the French menace. At last we fell to discussing what Bonaparte might be up to, which is what I wished to hear in the first place. He moved to her side of the bed and paused at the bedside table. She heard him place his sleeve buttons in the porcelain bowl. He began unbuttoning his shirt. He was undressing right in front of her. But Mr. Darcy was treating this as commonplace, and so was she. Indeed, her only response was to place her book on the table. "You might like to know," he went on, "that Captain Simmons is now engaged to Miss Rutherford. I believe we can expect to hear wedding bells this Christmastide." He twinkled at her. "As you know, I'm rather partial to Christmas weddings." Elizabeth averted her eyes, shy under the intensity of his gaze. Reserved Mr. Darcy, smiling at her like that. She adjusted her position, and a flash of gold caught her eye. Something twinkled on her hand, her left hand. Elizabeth stared at her fingers, and her heart began to hammer. It couldn't be, but it was. A gold wedding band. I'm glad you've been enjoying your book, Mr. Darcy continued. When I left tonight, you seemed rather low. She heard herself say, Not low exactly. He paused with brows raised, a questioning look, but without scorn. Now it was her turn to smile an apology. It's this dreary, endless rain. Elizabeth felt herself shrug, and suffered another shock. Her hair, it was loose, tumbling over her shoulders. Where was her cap? For that matter, where was her thick flannel nightdress? She was wearing— no, she couldn't be wearing— a silk chemise. Thin and clinging, it was positively indecent. Why did she not seem to notice? Didn't she care? Mr. Darcy sat on the bed, smiling down at her in a most unsettling manner. Elizabeth found herself gazing at his adorable dimples and the cleft in his shapely chin. Why had she never noticed how handsome he was? His fingers gently brushed a stray lock of hair from her eyes. Shall we escape? To a land bathed in sunshine, she said. Your Mr. Bonaparte has made travel difficult. Now Mr. Darcy was leaning over her, tenderly kissing her neck, then her chin and the lobe of her ear. Ah, he murmured, but there is nothing like staying at home for real comfort. At home, with him. Fitzwilliam. She heard her voice whisper. This was his Christian name. Why had she never before used it? Eagerly, her arms reached to return his embrace, pulling him closer. She felt herself surrender to the pleasure of his lips upon hers. Kissing Mr. Darcy. She was kissing Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth no longer cared that she wore a thin chemise, or that her hair was tumbling down, only that the door was securely locked. A gust of wind hurled rain against the window panes. Elizabeth, overcome with desire, did not care. There was a blinding flash of light. An explosion of thunder followed. And then, screaming, Elizabeth gave a start, and Fitzwilliam Darcy disappeared. The screams continued. Elizabeth lay still for a moment, stunned by aching loss. He had been here, in this bed, kissing her, and she had welcomed him, desired him. A dream, only a dream. Elizabeth pressed her palms to her cheeks. A dream, not real. This was real. This room, this storm, and the screams. Whose screams? Jane's? At once, Elizabeth scrambled out of bed. Thank heaven, she now wore her flannel nightdress, shrugged into her woolen dressing-gown, and tied the sash securely. Out the door she stumbled, heedless of her bare feet. The passageway was not deserted. There were Jane and Miss Bates, and Caroline Bingley, with her neck wrapped in cloths. At the far end stood Mr. Bingley and Mr. Darcy, with his candle. A passageway was cold and draughty, hardly a surprise, since the wind was howling against the house. There, another flash of lightning. Thunder rattled the window panes. The storm was right overhead. A door opened, and Emma emerged with the candle. "Did it strike the house, do you think?" Mr. Bingley was saying to Mr. Darcy. "Should we check for fire?"
"Fire?" said Caroline hoarsely. "In this deluge? Impossible!"
"The roof tiles are of slate," Elizabeth heard Mr. Darcy say, "but one cannot be too careful. Perhaps it would be wise." Mr. Bingley took the candle and made for the staircase, but Mr. Darcy remained where he was. Elizabeth felt the back of her neck, but her hair was in its usual braid, not tumbling over her shoulders. Shyly she checked her hand, but the gold wedding band was gone. Even so, it was difficult to meet Mr. Darcy's solemn gaze. It was a dream, only a dream. What if it was not? What it could not possibly be? Was Aunt Jane at work? And yet the thought persisted. What if? What if it had been real? What if Mr. Darcy had experienced the dream along with her? Chapter 7. The following day dawned clear and bright, a rainless day, and today would be much the same. Bit by bit their isolation at Netherfield began to lessen. Yesterday morning Bingley went off on horseback, presumably to speak with Jane's father, and Tom Bertram disappeared as well, and did not reappear for dinner that night. Darcy suspected that he was looking for more robust gaming than Netherfield provided. He would find this with the militia, as birds of a feather. Like a lapdog, Darcy loitered about the house. He knew this was unnecessary. The flooded bridge at Brunsley would soon be repaired, enabling him to travel to London, and then on to Pemberley. And yet, how could he leave Netherfield? How could he leave Elizabeth? For he had kissed her. He had. It could not have been only a dream. Truth to tell, he longed to kiss her again. So here he was, hovering about, hoping for another kiss. And wasn't this a noble enterprise? Like those cursed fellows at the London assemblies, Almack's even, ogling the heiresses, waiting for the chance to drop a charming line or a romantic compliment, like Wickham, or worse, like Collins. With a sigh, Darcy retreated behind his newspaper. People could say what they wished about a reserved temperament. There were some things one was protected from doing. Therefore, he and Elizabeth spent the rainless day as people at a house party do, leisurely breakfasts, mornings spent in the company of books and newspapers, strolls through those parts of the garden that were not under water, usually in the company of Miss Woodhouse and Miss Bates. But Darcy did try to be more sociable. Wickham, blast him, was known for having happy manners. It was galling to learn anything from the man, but Darcy knew he ought to try. And Elizabeth's beautiful, intelligent gaze followed Darcy, provoking him, enchanting him, holding him prisoner. Across the room or across the table at meals, their eyes would meet, and she would smile. Or perhaps it was he who would be smiling. Yes, it was certainly him. Sometimes he could not help himself. Miss Bates would set them to playing childish games, or they would read aloud from books. Sometimes there was dancing, and always there was music. Elizabeth or Jane would play the pianoforte, and sing simple ballads. Darcy enjoyed these most of all. It no longer mattered that Elizabeth's mother was noisy and ambitious, and her younger sisters too, or that her portion was considered contemptible. He admired her. No, he loved her. Love. There, he had said it, or rather he had thought it, which was almost the same thing. The only question left was what to do. How to tell her what was in his heart? Would she respond in kind, or did she dislike him as much as ever? But she had kissed him in that dream. Surely this counted for something. His thoughts were interrupted by Lydia Bennet's voice. She, along with her sister Kitty, had come to call. "We are supposed to be shopping in Meryton," Lydia was saying, "and so we shall be later." Apparently the driver of the family carriage had been bribed to silence, a source of much hilarity. "We've already had the mumps," Kitty pointed out, "so it makes no difference. We simply had to come, Lizzie, for we've such news." Lydia took up the tale. "Mr. Collins leaves for Hunsford tomorrow, but oh, Lizzie, you will never believe it. He is engaged, actually engaged, to Charlotte Lucas." Elizabeth appeared stunned. "You cannot mean it," she said. Apparently her sisters did. "Lady Lucas held the engagement dinner yesterday night," Kitty assured her. "The wedding is set for early January." And then Darcy noticed Miss Woodhouse. She was looking hard at each of the sisters. "How very odd," she said. "I could have sworn that Mr. Collins's interests lay elsewhere. Not that I wish ill on Miss Lucas, did you say?" Lydia kept on talking. "And dear Wickham sends his love. He says it is not the same without you, Lizzie, although I cannot see why. We have the merriest evenings together." "It's all tipsy dance and jollity," gushed Kitty. "I beg your pardon," said Elizabeth. "It's the name of a song, Lizzie," Kitty protested. "You needn't look so cross." Actually, it was a line from Milton's Comus, but this fact would be lost on Kitty Bennet. Elizabeth's sisters soon took their leave. Darcy watched Elizabeth cross to the far side of the room and stand before the windows. Emma Woodhouse, meanwhile, was frowning at the carpet. "I do not understand it," Darcy heard her tell Miss Bates. "Mr. Collins' interests were so clearly in another direction. Ah, well, I have someone else in mind for her, at any rate." "You are always so clever, Miss Woodhouse," said Miss Bates. "Christmastide, as we well know, is such a time for weddings and engagements. It is a wonderful time of year." Would his own engagement be included with the rest? Darcy turned a page of his newspaper.
"I take no credit for dear Jane and Mr. Bingley. That match was already well under way. But his sister—"
Although Emma lowered her voice, Darcy could still hear.
"An alliance with Mr. Darcy would be very nice. It would bring both families together. As you know, when our Isabella married John Knightley, it answered in every way."
Darcy knew that he should excuse himself and go out, but Emma was bent on talking. He kept still behind his newspaper.
"My dear, dear Miss Woodhouse," began Miss Bates, "far be it from me to raise an objection of any kind. But Miss Bingley is not a soft-spoken sort of person, is she? And dear Mr. Darcy—" "And Mr. Darcy is," said Emma, interrupting. "Opposites attract. Now then," she went on, "if we could only manage to keep Mr. Bertram at home of an evening, he and Elizabeth could get on. He is much too fond of card-playing." "As was dear grandpapa," lamented Miss Bates, "although horse-racing was his downfall, as it is with so many gentlemen."
Darcy turned another page. Tom Bertram could go to the devil for all he cared. He'd had enough of the man's simpering ways and fashionable manners. But as the husband of Elizabeth? Preposterous.
"I dare say he will learn to outgrow it, although Mr. Knightley would probably disagree. He has the most old-fashioned notions as to character."
Emma hesitated for a moment.
"But no, Elizabeth is too lovely and too charming to marry just anyone. She deserves to be the next Lady Bertram, and if I have my way, so shall she be."
Young Tom did appear for dinner that night, probably for reasons of economy. Meals at whatever tavern he'd found in Meryton cost money, and money seemed to be in short supply. And what was this? The man's gold timepiece, with its collection of dangling fobs, was missing from his waistcoat tonight. Card games could be costly, particularly if one was as stupid as Tom Bertram looked to be. Caroline Bingley was carried down to dinner, much to everyone's surprise.
"Her fever has been gone since morning,"
explained Jane, as she helped the footman guide Miss Bingley to her usual seat at the table.
"Mr. Jones says cheerful conversation will help restore her spirits. It is disheartening to be shut away."
But did Miss Bingley wish to be cheered up? Darcy had his doubts. She appeared pale and cross, and her throat was well wrapped up, although not enough to conceal a necklace of glittering emeralds and a rope of pearls. Darcy gave a sidelong glance at Tom Bertram. Yes, he was staring at her. How could the man not notice such an opulent display? Caroline looked on, open-mouthed, as the company trooped in. Trooped was the only way to describe their noisy entrance. Under her brother's management, the Netherfield guests sat where they wished, talked across the table, and generally ignored Miss Bingley's ceremonious niceties. Darcy had his usual seat beside Elizabeth. "Tell me again," he heard Caroline say to Elizabeth, "why you and Jane are staying here." Elizabeth attempted to explain, but Miss Bingley was not having any. She rounded on her brother. "My dear Charles," she called down the table, above the hum of conversation, "you ought to be in London." For someone who was supposed to be sick. There was certainly nothing wrong with her voice. Darcy leaned toward Elizabeth. "Now we're in for it," he murmured. "You must leave at once, do you hear? Now that the rain has stopped, that rubbishy bridge is passable." The others fell silent. Charles spoke up. "I've decided to pay that mantua-maker's bill, Caro," he said. "A few pounds is not worth squabbling over." "But I say that it is. The gown was made in the wrong fabric, Charles. I cannot possibly wear it. Moreover, the mistake was not mine, but hers. I refuse to pay." The silence became awkward, and Miss Bates stepped in to fill it. "When I was a girl," she began, "we learned to make our own dresses. It was difficult at first, for we made the most amusing mistakes. Later, when we were older, my sister and I turned dear mamma's gowns and made new ones for ourselves." Caroline's thundering glare showed what she thought of shabby genteel economies. Darcy exchanged a laughing look with Elizabeth. Tom Bertram spoke up. "Hear, hear," he cried. "You should not have to pay, Miss Bingley. At least not right away. Make her wait." He broke into a wide grin. "What's she going to do? Dun you?" Caroline Bingley looked down the table at him with wide eyes. "Better and better," Darcy murmured to Elizabeth. "In 6 months' time she'll sing a different tune," Bertram went on. 10 to 1 she'll buy the thing back. What's to keep her from selling that cursed dress to someone else?" Caroline brightened. "You see, Charles, what is a mantua-maker after all?" "Debts of honour," said Tom Bertram. "Now those are a different matter, but tradesmen's bills—" He shrugged. "Never mind having a good name," Darcy pointed out. Caroline rounded on him. "A good name has nothing to do with it," she said. "The fault was hers, not mine, and this is not the only way in which I have been wronged." She turned a wrathful eye on Elizabeth. At that unfortunate moment, Elizabeth's fork dropped onto the floor. Darcy saw her glance down at it and wince. Immediately, he gave her his unused dessert fork. This did not escape Caroline Bingley's notice. "Really, Mr. Darcy, the footman ought to be the one to replace that. You, of all people, should allow him to do his job." "Lucky him," said Darcy, but instead of smiling at her, he allowed his eyes to narrow. "Let us hope this oversight does not cause him to be— what is the expression? Sacked?" Caroline's chin came up. "Miss Bingley," called Emma Woodhouse, "it is such a pleasure to have you here at dinner with us. I trust you are feeling better." Caroline Bingley passed a hand over her eyes. "Why," she said crossly, "are these people in my house?" "Indeed," said Darcy pleasantly. "That is something I ask myself. Why am I here?" "Not you, Mr. Darcy. I did not mean—" "I trust that in future you will say what you do mean," said Darcy mildly, "and leave unsaid those things that you do not." She gasped. She actually gasped. Darcy did not care. Caroline Bingley could look as angry as she liked. Illness did not give anyone the right to be rude to guests. Darcy now became aware of Emma Woodhouse's dismayed expression. This was not the most promising exchange for a budding matchmaker to observe. The sooner she abandoned her scheme to pair him with Caroline, the better. At the conclusion of their meal, Bingley rose to his feet. "Ahem," he announced. "As we have callers waiting in the drawing-room, perhaps we should go in together and have our port and coffee brought there. What say you, Caroline?" Miss Bingley did not bother to disguise her irritation. "Which callers would these be, Charles?" Bingley lifted a calling card from the salver. "For one," he said, "the Reverend Philip Elton, Vicar of Highbury." "What?" cried Emma Woodhouse. "Mr. Elton here?" "And then we have Ned Parkes, of Longbourn Estate." He smiled at Elizabeth. "That cannot be right," Elizabeth whispered to Darcy. "Ned Park oversees our stables." "And Mr. Macready, whoever he is," Bingley went on, moving through the cards, "and our good neighbour Sir Hugh, and Mr. George Wickham." "Wickham?" "I know it's late, Caro," added Bingley, "but Mr. Elton has come some distance, and Sir Hugh is the magistrate. We can't very well turn him away." The magistrate? And Wickham? What luck! Darcy directed an inquiring look at Elizabeth. "Who is Macready?" he said in a low voice. That is to say, I believe he is a businessman," she whispered back, "who happens to lend money to people." "Oh-ho." Darcy directed a quick look at Tom Bertram. The man was definitely looking white about the gills. Wickham and a moneylender, and the magistrate. Darcy rose to his feet and offered an arm to Elizabeth. "Sounds like a most interesting evening," he remarked. "Mr. Darcy," said Caroline in a die-away voice, "have you failed to notice, sir, that I require assistance?" She wound her pearls around her fingers and made a play with her eyelashes. Darcy gazed at her for a long moment. "Your footmen look to be strong enough and quite capable of carrying you in," he replied. Politeness caused him to leave the remainder unsaid. "You, of all people, ought to allow them to do their jobs." Caroline Bingley's eyes flashed. "I, being quite exhausted," she said coldly, "find that I am not up to receiving guests. Do ring the bell." And then Darcy heard a slight sound. Tom Bertram stood alongside Caroline's chair. "My dear Miss Bingley," he said, making a bow, "I beg you will allow me." Keeping a straight face at that precise moment was one of the most difficult things Darcy had ever done. Chapter 8. Into the drawing-room they went. Elizabeth kept her gaze averted. If Mr. Wickham were present, she had no desire to converse with him. Emma Woodhouse followed so closely behind that she nearly tread on Elizabeth's heels. "Are you acquainted with our vicar, Mr. Elton?" whispered Emma into Elizabeth's ear. "Is that why he is smiling so?" Mr. Elton had to be the dark-haired man in clerical attire. When he caught sight of Emma, he fairly leapt from his chair. "Miss Woodhouse, how wonderful to see you, and in such good health." He impulsively put out a hand, but Emma did not take it. "How do you do, Mr. Elton?" she said solemnly. "May I present Miss Bennet and—" Emma glanced behind her. "And Mr. Darcy." Mr. Elton's smile dimmed to politeness. No wonder Emma was flustered, for wedged into Mr. Elton's buttonhole was not a silk flower, but a sprig of Christmas mistletoe. Elizabeth's gaze shifted to Emma. Had she noticed this? Mr. Elton turned a glowing face to Emma, and dug in a pocket of his frock-coat. "I have a letter from your father, somewhere." He gave an awkward laugh.
"And one from dear Harriet as well," said Emma. "How is she faring?"
"Who?" said Mr. Elton blankly. "Oh, Miss Smith. Well enough, I suppose. To be honest, I have no idea. Here is your letter."
"But," said Emma, taking it, "have you seen nothing of Miss Smith?"
"Perhaps at one of the services," he said, shrugging. "It must be at least a fortnight since."
"Mr. Elton," said Emma, interrupting, "why are you wearing mistletoe?"
Mr. Elton's cheeks grew pink. He removed the sprig, twirling the stems between his fingers. "'Tis the season, don't you know?"
"The season for what?" said Emma.
"Why, for kisses, and, you know, for love." Elizabeth heard Mr. Darcy disguise laughter in a fit of coughing. Wretched man. And yet how could she blame him? What a dreadful situation, for Elton's mannerisms were very similar to what Mr. Collins's had been. The nervous twisting of his fingers, the flushed cheeks, and too bright smile.
"Mr. Elton," demanded Emma, "was it father who sent you here, or did you receive a letter from someone else?"
Someone else? Elizabeth caught her breath. Did Emma mean Aunt Jane? Mr. Elton just stood there, blinking. "Why, I—" Emma's face paled.
"Pray excuse me while I read this," she said, and fled from the drawing-room.
Elizabeth did not mean to catch Mr. Darcy's eye. She did not mean to laugh either. He promptly offered his arm and led her toward one of the sofas and away from Mr. Elton.
"Poor Miss Woodhouse,"
Elizabeth whispered. "She has attracted quite a suitor," he remarked. "He'd best mind his teacup, as those mistletoe berries are poisonous. Not the most effective courtship technique, dying." Again Elizabeth had to swallow laughter. Who knew Mr. Darcy could be so witty?
"He reminds me of Mr. Collins, don't you think?" she confided. "Not in appearance, but in manner."
Almost Mr. Darcy's lips twisted into a grin.
"I wonder," Elizabeth continued, "among clerics, is Christmas the season for courtship?"
He laughed outright at that, and she gracefully took a seat on the sofa. "Would you care for coffee or tea, Miss Elizabeth?"
"Tea, I think," she said unsteadily. "Thank you."
As Mr. Darcy moved away, Elizabeth gave a quick glance around the drawing-room. There was Mr. Wickham in his red coat, smiling as he rotated the stem of his wine-glass. Ned Parkes, Longbourn's stableman, sat beside Sir Hugh. He looked very out of place. At a low table, apart from the men, Jane was pouring out. Of Caroline Bingley there was no sign, which was just as well. She would not like seeing Jane as acting hostess. Mr. Darcy returned with Elizabeth's tea. As she lifted the cup, George Wickham's familiar laugh drifted across the drawing-room. Elizabeth hesitated, caught by a memory. If what Mr. Darcy said about him was true, then— Again, Elizabeth's gaze wandered, this time moved by curiosity. Was there a scar on Mr. Wickham's ear? If he would just turn his head, she might be able to see. Unfortunately, the man caught her gaze, and he boldly lifted his wine-glass in salute. Elizabeth felt the blood rush to her cheeks, and then Mr. Wickham winked at her. What brazen insolence! How could she have thought him charming? And how dreadful that Mr. Darcy had noticed the exchange. "I can see no scar on his ear," she said to him, "and yet I cannot disbelieve that you struck Mr. Wickham. Indeed," she added, "it would be a wonder if you did so only once." "The temptation," Mr. Darcy replied gravely, "presents itself often." Just then Sir Hugh, the magistrate, rose to his feet. "No doubt you are wondering why I have come," he announced. "As you may have guessed, this is not precisely a social visit." At once conversation stilled. Sir Hugh placed a chair facing the group and settled into it, with his hands resting on his knees. "Nor does it involve a serious criminal matter," he went on. "Still, I would like to solve the mystery here, as civilized people, without having to involve the courts of assize." The stopper rattled in the counter. Tom Bertram was helping himself to another glass of port. "We had an incident in Meryton this afternoon," Sir Hugh continued, "involving Mr. Macready here, and this officer of the militia." He indicated Mr. Wickham. Mr. Wickham was smiling. Of course he was. How could have Elizabeth thought the man attractive or sincere? Emma Woodhouse returned to the drawing-room just then. At once Mr. Darcy surrendered his seat on the sofa. Mr. Wickham rose to his feet and made a bow. "George Wickham," he said pleasantly, "of the Staffordshire Militia, at your service." After he was seated, Mr. Wickham's gaze wandered to Elizabeth, and Emma came under his notice. Elizabeth saw his eyes widen and then narrow as he took in every detail of Emma's appearance. The string of pearls, clasped carelessly about her neck, held particular interest. Why, the man was a rogue, sizing up Emma's worth in that odious way. Poor Emma must have noticed, for she did not remain long in the drawing-room. "The conundrum involves this," said Sir Hugh. From a pocket he drew a sparkling bracelet, Elizabeth's very own amethyst bracelet. Elizabeth gasped aloud. She could not help it. "Mr. Ned Parkes," prompted Sir Hugh, "are you able to identify this item?" Ned cleared his throat. "That there bangle is Miss Elizabeth's, sure as I'm alive, and what it was doing in the hands of that maggoty person, as he was a-selling it to the likes of Macready, is what I'd like to know." A rush of whispering swept the room. "Not you, your honour," amended Ned. "That there officer is the maggoty person, I mean." Elizabeth could only stare. There must be some mistake. Her bracelet was in the drawer of the dressing-table upstairs. And then she remembered. The day the rain stopped, she had worn it. "Continue, Mr. Parkes," said Sir Hugh. "That fellow," Ned indicated Wickham, "was in Mr. Macready's office for to pawn it. I happened on them by chance. It's thievery, that's what it is." All eyes shifted to George Wickham. He was continuing to smile without a trace of shame. Elizabeth wished that she could say the same for herself, and yet she knew she must speak. She had no other alternative. "May I see the bracelet, please?" she said. Everyone remained silent while Sir Hugh brought it to her. "This is mine," she admitted. "How it came to be in Mr. Wickham's possession I do not know. Jane wore this the night of Mr. Bingley's ball." Mr. Wickham said not a word. Did he care nothing for her reputation? A man whom she had counted as a friend would leave her with no defence. Ned spoke up. "Did you give this officer your bangle, miss, or did he steal it?" Wickham made an impatient gesture. "As I told the magistrate," he said, "and you, if you care to recall it, this bauble was staked as a wager by a gentleman. It became my property in the course of the game." Elizabeth saw Mr. Darcy turn to Tom Bertram. Mr. Bertram's face and cheeks were pink. He took a large swallow of wine. Sir Hugh held out the bracelet. "You admit that this is your property, Miss Elizabeth?" "I do." "And how did it leave your possession?" "I must have lost it while I was walking outside the other day. I was not paying attention. The clasp is faulty." "I will attest to the broken clasp," said Mr. Darcy. His support gave her courage to continue. "To be honest," said Elizabeth, "I did not realize that it was missing until now." The magistrate did not look impressed. "You were walking outside in the garden, in the rain, Miss Elizabeth." He lowered his voice. It will do no good to shield this officer. If he stole it, he must be made to admit it."
"I did go out, Sir Hugh, yesterday morning, after the rain stopped."
"Rather mucky for a walk, wouldn't you say?"
"We had been shut up in the house for so long, it was a relief to go out."
"So you did not give your bracelet to Mr. Wickham?"
"I did not, sir."
Sir Hugh turned to Mr. Wickham. "And you say that it came into your hands in the course of a game? Very pretty, that," remarked Ned.
Mr. Wickham rounded on Ned Parkes. "Gaming debts between gentlemen are something you would know nothing about."
Ned gave a snort. "You, a gentleman? That's rich." Sir Hugh interrupted this exchange. "But who staked the bracelet? That is what I want to know."
"My lips," said Mr. Wickham primly, "are sealed."
"You will keep silent and call into question a lady's reputation."
"So it would seem." Mr. Wickham's smile reappeared. "Mine honour as a gentleman must take precedence."
"Oh, come now."
It was Mr. Darcy who rose to his feet. Clearly he was annoyed.
"Since when have you cared for honour, Wickham? You've fleeced some poor fellow, that is all, and you hope to do so again, so you keep your mouth shut about his identity."
Wickham spread his hands. "A faithful friend who can find," he recited.
"You've already won the money in his pocket, and his timepiece too, am I right?" Mr. Darcy went on. "In flat despair he returns to Netherfield and finds in the shrubbery a honeyfall, an amethyst bracelet, so he lets that stand against his debt." He turned. "Isn't that so, Bertram?"
Tom Bertram's pink face was now scarlet. It was in the mud," he stammered. "Buried like. How was I to know it belonged to Miss Elizabeth?"
Mr. Wickham was now scowling. "I am no thief. I stole nothing." Darcy stepped forward and laid a hand on Tom Bertram's shoulder. "A simple mistake," he said. "The sort of misunderstanding that can happen when one is desperate. Miss Elizabeth now has her bracelet. All that remains is for Mr. Wickham to return the money to Mr. McGreedy."
"But—"
said Wickham.
"That's it, Mr. Darcy," said Hugh.
"What of it, Mr. Wickham?"
"That bracelet was rightfully mine. The money is mine as well. But you pawned Miss Elizabeth's bracelet without her permission. I stammered Mr. Wickham. For the first time he looked uncomfortable. Elizabeth saw him give a tug to his collar.
"Return Mr. McGreedy's money," said Mr. Darcy mildly, "and then settle up with Bertram some other way. What's the figure, Mr. McGreedy?"
£5.
"There you are, Wickham. £5. A small price to pay to redeem a lady's reputation. And your own." Mr. Darcy rocked back on his heels, studying Mr. Wickham. There was a short silence, during which Mr. Wickham went very red in the face.
"Really, Darcy," he protested, "I don't carry money."
Mr. Darcy smiled. It was a cold smile, Elizabeth thought, but not unattractive. "Is that so?" he said. "You have been in Meryton for a month. Tradesmen become impatient for payment. I do hope that some of them have been paid with that £5. Wickham opened and closed his mouth like a fish. He wheeled on Tom Bertram.
"You!" he cried. "You'll pay for this!"
Sir Hugh lifted his voice. "Now that Mr. Darcy brings it to mind, I have heard a thing or two about outstanding debts, Mr. Wickham. Your outstanding debts." Elizabeth had heard enough. Amid the raised voices of the men, she slipped out of the drawing-room and into the cool of the upper hall. She pressed her fingers to her cheeks and willed herself to think. Where to find refuge quickly? Her bedchamber? No, it was too far. Better yet, the ballroom. The doors were ajar. Behind her, the drawing-room door came open and closed. Elizabeth stood like a statue. She did not dare to look to see who came out. "Here is your bracelet, Miss Elizabeth," said Mr. Darcy's quiet voice. Elizabeth turned to him with a sigh of relief. He was holding it out to her, so she opened her hands to receive it. Oh, Mr. Darcy, she confessed. I was never so embarrassed. I thought you handled the situation very well, he said mildly. To my mind, Wickham takes the prize for humiliation. He does not have the money to pay Macready. She lifted her eyes to his. What of Mr. Bertram? That young fool. A salutary lesson. If he'd been content to play for Miss Bates's penny points, this would never have happened. I will give Bertram the £5 if it comes to that. Elizabeth could not return his smile. It is I who have been the fool, Mr. Darcy. He looked at her rather searchingly. You don't mind about Wickham too much, do you? Meaning, is my heart broken? Surprisingly, no. I was charmed by him, that is all. I should have known better than to believe everything he said. He excels at being plausible. Even my own father was taken in. Elizabeth discovered that Mr. Darcy had taken her hands into his own. His were warm and surprisingly gentle. She would have returned their clasp, if not for the bracelet she held. Elizabeth, he said softly. She lifted her eyes to his. And then Emma Woodhouse's voice carried sharply into the upper hall. Mr. Elton! Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy shared a startled look. Was Emma in the empty ballroom? There was more. You forget yourself, sir, Emma cried out. Then came the sound of a stinging slap. Mr. Darcy lifted an eyebrow. So much for the power of mistletoe, he remarked. Chapter 9. And so much, Darcy thought wryly, for my feeble attempt at romance. For Elizabeth had at once stepped away, pulling her hand from his. He felt the loss keenly. Out from the ballroom came Emma Woodhouse, with flaming cheeks and blazing eyes. Had Elton thrown caution to the winds and forced a passionate kiss? Darcy knew he ought to feel pity for the man, but, alas, it was all he could do not to laugh. "Oh!" cried Miss Woodhouse. "Insufferable man!" Darcy leaned in and caught Elizabeth's eye. Romance novels, he told her, are most unhelpful. Once a fellow takes to reading those, he's doomed. "I beg your pardon," cried Miss Woodhouse. "I merely mean," explained Darcy, "that novels are not a reliable guide to courtship. If a man's suit is unwelcome, a display of passion only makes matters worse." As if on cue, Elton appeared at the open doorway, looking remarkably angry, with a scarlet patch on his left cheek. Without meeting Darcy's eye, Elton put up his chin and stalked down the stairs to the entrance hall. He could then be heard demanding his hat and coat. Darcy glanced down at Elizabeth's hands. Surely there was no chance of holding them while Emma Woodhouse was here. Then, too, she was still holding her bracelet. "Shall I keep your bracelet in my pocket?" said Darcy softly. She passed it to him at once. He murmured something about having the clasp mended, but was interrupted by shouting in the drawing-room. "Dear me," he remarked, "apparently Wickham's charm is unequal to the occasion." Miss Woodhouse drew near to Elizabeth. "If you saw how Mr. Elton looked at me, heard how he spoke to me," Darcy heard her say. "I quite understand," said Elizabeth. "You have no idea how well. Why is it that men are so stupid?" "It is because we cannot help ourselves, Miss Woodhouse," Darcy said. He looked to Elizabeth. "We men are hopelessly inept when it comes to matters of the heart." "Matters of the heart?" cried Miss Woodhouse. "Mr. Elton loves Harriet, not me.
He gave every sign, every indication of sincere and heartfelt attachment. Well, she amended, after a pause, if not precisely every sign, near enough. I was thoroughly taken in. What I shall say to poor Harriet, I do not know. It is awkward, yes, agreed Elizabeth. Mr. Knightley did say this might happen with Mr. Elton, that he preferred me, but I would not believe him. The drawing-room door jerked open. I'll not stay and be insulted, shouted George Wickham. Darcy kept his face expressionless, as Wickham came striding out. Then again, he added over his shoulder, what can be expected from ignorant, prejudicial rustics? Wickham had the audacity to look at Elizabeth then. Was he seeking her support? Darcy put a possessive hand to the small of her back. Wickham's lips twisted into a sneer. Like Elton before him, he strode to the stairs and descended. Ned Parkes and Mr. Macready followed with a purposeful gait. Darcy hid another smile. It would be best for Wickham to travel the road back to Meryton at a run. Sir Hugh appeared next. "I'm sorry for the fracas, Bingley," he said, taking his leave. "Better to have the rumpus now than to wait for the assizes. The sooner that fellow is gone from the district, the better. Good evening." Darcy nodded to Sir Hugh, and, in answer to Charles' mute inquiry, slightly shook his head. Bingley returned to the drawing-room. Sir Hugh made his way down the stairs. "All my fine plans," said Miss Woodhouse to Elizabeth, "are quite ruined. I had so wished you to be a titled lady, but now I see that it would never do, nor will the match I had in mind for Miss Bingley." She sighed heavily. "I wonder why Aunt Jane sent me here at all." Darcy lifted an eyebrow. "A match could be coming Miss Bingley's way. She rather fancies being a titled lady." "Do you mean with Mr. Bertram? I was much deceived in him. Why, he is little better than a gamester. Why did I not see this?" "We all have our areas of blindness," said Elizabeth. "For my part, I was taken in by George Wickham's glib charm." "Him? Charming?" Miss Woodhouse wrinkled her nose. "He is quite commonplace, is he not?" Darcy gave a crack of laughter. To a man of Wickham's stamp, there was no worse insult. Below, in the entrance hall, there were voices. Sir Hugh departing, Darcy assumed. The main door closed and was bolted. Then came the butler, ascending the stairs with a small silver tray. A caller? Darcy peered over the banister rail. Sure enough, a man in a greatcoat stood below, hat in hand. "Oh, well," said Miss Woodhouse, "he is gone now, and so is Mr. Elton. I suppose the last laugh belongs to Mr. Knightley." "Miss Woodhouse?" The man below gazed up at them, and then began to mount the stairs. When he reached the landing, Emma Woodhouse gave a gasp of recognition. "Mr. Knightley!" she cried, and ran down to meet him. He stepped back a pace, gripping the banister rail with a firm hand. His hat fell behind onto the stairs. "Oh," she cried, "how I wanted you!" "You did?" said the man, who was obviously Knightley. "Yes, for it was just as you said, Mr. Elton. Oh, I am not supposed to say what happened, am I? But I dare say you can guess what he said to me." "I dare say I can," said Mr. Knightley pleasantly. His arm slipped around her shoulders. "Poor Emma." "And that is not the worst of it," she confessed, as they ascended together. "All my schemes, every one of my matchmaking endeavours, have ended in disaster." "That is only to be expected, you know." "But, Mr. Knightley, you are wet." Miss Woodhouse brushed droplets from the lapels of his coat. "It is raining again, I'm afraid," he said. "A wet trot to Meryton for Wickham,"
said Darcy to Elizabeth. Miss Woodhouse then became aware of her surroundings.
Do come and meet my delightful new friends, Miss Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy.
Mr. Knightley's head came up. Darcy, you don't say. He shook Darcy's hand warmly. Do you know one another? I have heard of him, said Mr. Knightley, smiling. Darcy was not sure what to make of this. The drawing-room door opened, and Miss Bates came rustling out.
Mr. Knightley, she called, how delightful to hear your name announced. Do come in and warm yourself. Everyone else has gone away, save for Mr. Bertram, but he is in the sulks.
Darcy saw Knightley hesitate, but he answered with perfect cordiality. A cheerful fireside will be very welcome, thank you. He looked down at Emma, who nestled against his shoulder. I am come to take you home, you know, he said. You and Miss Bates. Miss Woodhouse looked at him shyly.
Did father send you?
Yes, my dear, he did, along with, someone else. The drawing-room door closed behind them. In the sulks, is he? Poor Bertram, said Mr. Darcy.
And poor Emma. It is hard to have schemes go awry, as well as being sized up by suitors. He certainly did so.
Darcy smiled fondly down at her.
He? Mr. Wickham. I caught him looking at Emma, as if he were judging the merits of a horse.
The drawing-room door opened, and the butler came out. So did Mr. Knightley. Darcy, he said, I have something for you. Being situated so near to London, I am often called upon to perform errands for our aunt. Darcy's eyes narrowed. Aunt, he repeated softly. Aunt Jane? Aunt Jane Austen, yes. From a pocket, Knightley removed a folded paper. A letter? She was most insistent that I give this to you as soon as I arrived. To save time, she said. I surmise that she is rather in a hurry. For what? Said Darcy, all at sea. For the happy ending. You know, a merry Yuletide for one and all. Apparently there was too much angst building up, too many complications. Complications, said Darcy. There was something in Knightley's smile that made Darcy uneasy. He unfolded the paper he'd been given. The letterhead was unmistakable. Vicar General, the Faculty Office of the Archbishop of Canterbury. Darcy's cheeks began to burn. Doctor's Commons? He whispered. You went to Doctor's Commons? If I were you, said Knightley pleasantly, I'd not delay beyond tomorrow. There's snow in the air. Impossible. It's not nearly cold enough. I dare say it will be, said Knightley, smiling again. Your sister and Mrs. Annesley will be ready to depart for Pemberley as soon as you arrive in London. As for what should happen before that time, you know best. With a nod, Mr. Knightley returned to the drawing-room.
What is it?
Said Elizabeth, drawing nearer. Is something wrong? At once, Darcy refolded the license. Nothing is wrong, he managed to say. To the contrary, everything has suddenly come right. Chapter 10. That license fairly burned a hole in Darcy's pocket. He must speak. After all, where was the risk? He had Aunt Jane's blessing. Or perhaps not. For a questioning expression now lurked in Elizabeth's beautiful eyes. Darcy drew a long breath. He dare not assume victory. Collins and Elton had made that mistake. Was it now his turn to be roundly refused? Would Fitzwilliam Darcy, the prize of the matrimonial market, face the cruel irony of a rebuff? And yet he dare not delay, for this private moment would not last. Even now he could hear someone playing the pianoforte in the drawing-room. With a hammering heart, Darcy reached for Elizabeth's hand. Her fingers were cold. He covered them with his own to warm them. "Elizabeth," he began, and then he stopped, for there was a clattering in the hall below. "What now?" he muttered. Elizabeth's eyes twinkled. "A footman has dropped the teapot," she suggested. "Or perhaps it is Mr. Wickham returning to challenge someone to a duel." Darcy felt his lips curve into a smile. "Never that. Wickham is not a crack shot, and he knows that I am." "Are you?" His smile turned into a grin. "Near enough." He took another long breath and said, "Elizabeth." Again he stopped. Was he mad to be proposing in a public passageway? Darcy released Elizabeth's hand. "I won't be a moment," he told her. "Wait right here." Into the drawing-room he went. On a table beside a sofa was what he needed, a branched candlestick. Jane was at the pianoforte, with Miss Bates standing behind. "Christmas is coming," sang Miss Bates in a warbling soprano. "The goose is getting fat." That song again. Darcy's fingers closed around the candlestick's column, and Miss Bates paused. "Mr. Knightley," he heard her call, "do come and sing with me. You too, Miss Woodhouse." Heaven help them, and him too, if he was noticed. But he had no such luck, for Darcy heard her say his name. "You're just the man we need," gushed Miss Bates. "I would so love to form a choir for wassailing, but Mr. Bertram refuses to join us. Do say that you will." Presently, perhaps." Darcy snatched up the candlestick, sending a shower of wax onto his sleeve, and fled. Elizabeth met him on the other side of the drawing-room door. Thank goodness she was smiling. "Miss Bates is singing?" "I fear so." Darcy turned to secure the door. "I pity that Christmas goose. And us if Miss Bates comes out and finds us. She is laying plans for wassailing." "Oh, surely not until Christmas." He answered with a speaking look. "She thinks," he said, "that we ought to practice." Elizabeth gave a gurgle of laughter. "Oh, dear." "Come," said Darcy, quickly. He caught Elizabeth's hand and drew her across the passageway and into the ballroom. He set the candlestick on the floor and turned to close the doors. As before, rain tapped steadily at the windows. Darcy kept still, listening for sounds of pursuit. "Are we safe?" Elizabeth whispered. "I believe so." But what this? Something was wrong with his voice. He could not propose sounding like a goose. In other words, like Collins. Darcy drew forward a chair for her. "So we return to the scene of the crime," she said laughingly. "Poor Emma! Look, here is Mr. Elton's mistletoe." She bent to pick up the fallen sprig. "And poor you as well," said Darcy. He saw her eyes find the floor, and he heard her sigh. "I was hoping that he would forget about Mr. Collins, and what he said to me. His list of my deficiencies was painfully accurate." Darcy felt himself wince. He'd embarrassed her, the last thing he intended. Gently he removed Elton's mistletoe from her grasp, and let it fall to the floor. "I realize," he said, "that this is neither the time nor the place." And it wasn't. Everything about this proposal was wrong. He had not spoken to her father, he had no ring, and, heaven help him, he ought to be kneeling. The rain continued to strike the windows. But it now occurred to Darcy that it was a gentle sound, right as rain. Yes, everything about this proposal might be wrong, but at the same time everything was right, even though he did not know what her answer would be. He gazed at Elizabeth's face, made more beautiful by the rosy candlelight. "Hear my soul speak," said Darcy softly. The words were Shakespeare's. Not perhaps the most eloquent beginning, but heartfelt. His gaze never left her eyes as he lowered himself to one knee, his heart thundering in his chest. Elizabeth became very still. He reached for her soft hand, cradling it in his own, pleased to find it was cold no longer. He felt her fingers tremble. Darcy trembled too. "I love you dearly, Elizabeth," he said simply, "with all my heart." And then he found that he could speak, for she was smiling. "I am as great a fool as Collins," he confessed in a rush, "and I have been in mortal fear of sounding as ridiculous as he, in desiring such a prize. But I do love you, Elizabeth, truly." Did she give his fingers a gentle, reassuring squeeze? "You may dislike me as heartily as you do, Collins, and I would not blame you," he went on, "but I wonder if—" Here Darcy paused, for upon this question hung all his future happiness. "I wonder if you love me enough to consider becoming my wife." "If I love you enough," cried Elizabeth. "Of course I love you enough." Darcy could not help himself. He stood to his feet and caught Elizabeth in a crushing embrace, pressing his lips to hers. He was overwhelmed as she cupped his face with her hands. Only the threat of imminent discovery made him break the kiss. After that, there were glorious wedding details to work out. Darcy did not intend to wait if he could help it. "Since you are unable to return home," he began. "Because of the mumps," Elizabeth put in, smiling, "and Mamma's interference." "I rise up and call her blessed," said Darcy. "Now then, what I am wondering is this. Would you enjoy spending Christmas with me at Pemberley?" "With you?" she repeated. "And with my sister." "As your, or rather her, guest? With Jane?" "Not with Jane," Darcy said gently, "and not as my guest. As my wife, dearest." But that is impossible, Fitzwilliam. How can we be married so soon? Moreover, what will people think?" Darcy could not help grinning, for she used his name, his Christian name. "I care nothing for what people think, but there is something I need to show you." He brought out the folded license and gave it to her. Elizabeth opened it and read it through without saying a word. "A special license," she said at last. She raised her astonished eyes to his. "How long have you had this?" "Not long," he said truthfully. "Of course not," she said, as if to herself. "It takes time. You had to send for it. But, Fitzwilliam, why did you not tell me sooner? Was it— Oh, I disliked you for the longest time, and with good reason." He put an arm around her. She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And all the while you loved me," she marvelled. "But when you heard Mr. Collins propose, what must you have thought? No wonder you threatened him with violence." "Did I?" said Darcy, bemused, watching the expression flit across her lovely face. "You did, and Mr. Wickham too." "I seem to have been quite busy." Darcy allowed himself to caress a lock of her silky hair, breathing in her scent. "Do you know," he said, "uppermost in my mind, once we settle the details of our wedding day, is discovering where my silver sleeve buttons are." She pulled away, knitting her brows. "Your what?" Darcy studied her expression. Perhaps it would be better if he did not bring up the dream. "It makes no difference. They will turn up somewhere." "Sleeve buttons," she repeated, "for your shirt." She remembered. "Actually," he said, "they could well be in my bedchamber at Pemberley. That is where I saw them last." He heard her gasp. "In your—" "But I digress," Darcy continued smoothly. I will call on your father in the morning, and, if possible, start for London in the afternoon, along with your family, those who are free to make the journey.
That would be every one of us, and Jane. I won't have Jane left behind.
Nor I. If all goes well, on the 3rd day from this we shall be married. He could barely contain his elation.
Married, she breathed. Will wonders never cease?
After a sumptuous wedding breakfast at a hotel of your choosing, Darcy went on, we'll be off for Pemberley. He paused. What say you to this plan? Elizabeth pressed a hand to her cheek.
It is all so sudden.
Is it too sudden, my dear? Would you prefer to wait? This was the right thing to ask, but deuced painful just the same.
People will say, you know what they will say.
I do indeed, he agreed gravely. No doubt it is the same for every couple, but we know the truth, you and I. Dearest Elizabeth, would you rather remain here with Jane? Elizabeth was now frowning at the floor.
I cannot return home because of the mumps, she said. Moreover, Miss Woodhouse and Miss Bates will be leaving, whereas Mr. Bertram—
She looked up.
Fitzwilliam, what of him?
I fear Bertram is out of funds, stranded here until quarter-day, and while I am willing to redeem his sorry watch from Mr. Macready, and reimburse the man for the money paid to Wickham for your bracelet, I draw the line at transporting Bertram to wherever he lives. Elizabeth smiled impishly.
So he must stay at Netherfield, with Caroline.
It was all Darcy could do not to laugh. It could do Bertram good. Bingley is not a gamester, and, as you know, he likes everyone. As for Miss Bingley, she might welcome the diversion, for once Charles tells her of his engagement to your sister,
a not-so-happy Christmas for her.
Must it be so for you? Darcy said gently. Would you prefer to spend Christmas at Netherfield, or with me at Pemberley? She was silent for a time, and Darcy held his breath. Aunt Jane or no, the choice was Elizabeth's.
To say truth, Fitzwilliam, she said at last, I would much rather spend Christmas with you.
Blushing, she fingered the license.
Even if it means marrying you in 2 days' time.
A coy smile reappeared.
I'll have you know, sir, that I am not usually so brazen, she added with a twinkle, or so impulsive. But in this case—
The only thing to do was to kiss her, more than once, and rather more passionately than before. Impulsiveness, Darcy decided, became his Elizabeth very well. Theirs would be a very happy Christmas indeed. This has been The Christmas Matchmaker, written by Laura Hile, narrated by Benjamin Fife. Copyright 2023 by Laura Hile. Production copyright by Laura Hile.